Good evening, my friend. How was your day today? Was it calm and steady, or did it rush by with tasks and noise? I'd love to hear how you are doing, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. This is a quiet corner for reflection, where history is told in whispers. And if you enjoy this gentle journey, remember to like the video, subscribe for more calm explorations, and ring the bell so you'll always know when a new story arrives for the night. Now, let us step softly into a world long ago, into the fragile beauty of the late Bronze Age. Picture the palaces of Mycenae, their walls painted with frescoes of warriors and ships. Torches flicker in the night, casting shadows that dance across the grand halls. Scribes sit bent over clay tablets, recording shipments of oil, jars of wine, and precious bronze ingots. The air smells of smoke and olive oil, the heartbeat of an empire in motion. Yet every record carved into clay ties this palace to distant lands. Its strength depended not only on stone walls, but on ships and strangers far across the sea. The copper that made bronze came from Cyprus. Tin may have traveled from mountains in Anatolia, or even from lands further west. Grain filled the storerooms, harvested from nearby fields, but always vulnerable to the changing skies. The late Bronze Age was not one land or one kingdom, but a web of many. Palaces stood as knots in that network, and the strings between them carried trade, diplomacy, and hope. Strong in appearance, the system was delicate, like a thread stretched too tight. Far to the east, on the Levantine coast, Ugarit thrived as a hub of commerce and diplomacy. Merchants filled its harbor, unloading jars of oil, copper ingots, stacked like bricks, and pottery bound for foreign courts. Within the palace, scribes worked tirelessly on clay tablets, writing to Egypt, to the Hittites, and to smaller neighbors. Their words tell us of trade, treaties, and sometimes urgent pleas for food. Ugarit was alive with voices, yet even there, fragility whispered in the background. These letters are treasures of memory. One requests grain to feed the hungry. Another arranges a shipment of copper, vital for the making of bronze. Another still speaks of trouble on the seas, of ships seen at night, their intent uncertain. Reading these tablets today, we hear the concerns of kings and merchants, their voices echoing across 3,000 years. Beneath the formal words lies a truth. This brilliant age balanced always on the edge of need. Across the sea, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stood tall among the Anatolian hills. Its gates carved with lions, its walls stretching wide. The empire seemed immovable, yet it too relied on grain from neighbors and metals brought from afar. Without steady supply, even its armies could falter. Kings may have worn crowns of power, but they too leaned on the fragile strands of trade. Beneath the stone towers, the same vulnerability pulsed. Egypt, under its pharaohs, held the Nile as a steady lifeline. The river's floods brought grain, feeding people and armies alike. Yet even mighty Egypt was tied into the web. Letters from foreign rulers begged for ships of wheat. Envoys carried gifts of gold and ivory, but beneath the beauty of diplomacy lay hunger and fear. Egypt was strong, yet even its power was part of the fragile rhythm of the age. The world of the late Bronze Age was dazzling in connection. Kings wrote in Akkadian, the language of diplomacy. Ships sailed from one harbor to another, carrying goods and ideas. Palaces glittered with imported treasures, ivory, lapis, lazuli, and fine textiles. Yet, the more connected the world became, the more each relied on the other. Like a chain, the strength depended on every link. And one weak link could send tremors across the entire web. Imagine the daily life of a farmer in a small village. His work was to grow grain, to feed his family, and to fill the storerooms of his palace lords. If the rains failed, his harvest would shrink. If the harvest shrank, the palace stores would dwindle. And if the palace stores dwindled, armies went unpaid, ships remained empty, and kings grew desperate. A single season of poor rain rippled outward, touching cities far beyond the village field. The Bronze Age thrived on movement. Ships carried copper, tin, and grain. Envoys crossed mountains with tablets and gifts. Traders moved through bustling harbors. Yet each movement required peace, stability, and trust. Without peace, roads grew dangerous. Without trust, ships were eyed with suspicion. The very lifelines of the age could be severed by fear or conflict. Think of the scribes. Day after day, they pressed symbols into clay. Each symbol stood for a shipment, a treaty, a promise. The tablets survived where walls crumbled, leaving us voices from the past. They did not write of myths, but of grain, ships, and debts. In their silence, we hear the fragility of the system. They remind us that history is not only battles, but also bread. At Mycenae, rulers looked over lands rich with olive groves and herds. Their strength rested on warriors, but also on merchants. Ships left harbors with amphorae filled with oil and wine, returning with metals and timber. Mycenaean palaces gleamed, yet they too felt the weight of dependence. A storm at sea, a raid on the coast, or a poor harvest at home could shake the palace halls. Strength and fragility walked together, side by side. In Cyprus, copper mines dug deep into the earth fed the age of bronze. Without Cyprus, there was no bronze. Its harbors shipped ingots shaped like ox hides, heavy and precious. These were carried across seas, traded for grain, oil, and goods. Cyprus was rich, yet it too relied on others for survival. Its gift was metal, but its need was food. Even the source of strength leaned on fragile ties. The late Bronze Age was a system of balance. Each kingdom supplied what another lacked. Some gave metals, others grain, others timber or textiles. Gifts moved like lifeblood across the Mediterranean. When the rhythm held, the age flourished. But when the rhythm faltered, the fragility of the system was revealed. What seemed unshakable could waver. What seemed eternal could fade. Travel now in thought to the harbors. Ships rocked gently on waves, sails furled against the wind. Workers carried cargo, shouting across the docks. Amphorae of wine, bundles of textiles, and jars of oil moved steadily. The sea was both a highway and a risk. A sudden storm could scatter fleets, and a hostile ship could burn a harbor. For every treasure that arrived, danger traveled too. The fragility of the age was not always seen by those who lived it. To them, the palaces seemed strong, the kings powerful, the ships steady. Only in hindsight can we see how delicate the balance was. The tablets, the ruins, the artifacts, they whisper the truth. Power rests on foundations we cannot always see. The Bronze Age glimmered, but beneath the glimmer, the threads strained. Tonight, as we wander gently through this history, remember that fragility is not weakness. It is the nature of all systems, ancient or modern. The late Bronze Age shows us how beauty and strength can exist beside vulnerability. Palaces stood, letters were written, ships sailed, but the balance was always delicate. And it is in that delicate balance that we find the story of a fragile age. The late Bronze Age looked radiant from a distance, a constellation of palaces and ports linked by ships and promises. But its brightest rooms depended on reigns that no king could command. Fields needed steady seasons, herds needed pastures that revived after winter, and granaries needed harvests that arrived on time. Around 1200 BCE, scholars see a long hesitation in the sky. Lake sediments darken with dust, pollen counts of moisture-loving plants fall, and tree rings narrow like belts tightened after a lean year. Villagers felt it first in the stubborn soil, then scribes felt it in the numbers they scratched upon clay, and finally kings felt it in faltering tribute and empty storehouses. Drought is history's quietest invader, creeping without banners, entering through the furrow rather than the gate. In this age, silence did what armies could not. Harvests slipped from abundance to adequacy, from adequacy to anxiety, until even prosperous courts spoke softly about grain. The shadow that crossed the Mediterranean was not a single cloud, but a season that would not end, a pattern that stretched across years and lives. Tonight, we will walk the dry paths with unhurried steps, tracing how the absence of rain reshaped a world that believed itself secure. Imagine a terraced hillside in Canaan at dawn, soil beaded with hopes that are not due. A farmer lifts his eyes to a sky that will not answer, then lowers them to wheat heads thin as a whisper. The field has always bargained with heaven, but this year heaven is hard to reach. His family eats first from habit, then from ration, then from resolve, cutting loaves thinner, stretching porridge with chaff. He knows the palace collectors will come, because the palace must feed guards and scribes and guests, and duty runs downhill. He prays the ledger will be kind, yet numbers do not pray back. When the cart creaks away with a share he cannot spare, a line tightens from his house to the court, and onward to distant allies who also count and wait. Drought begins as a private ache, a hollow between ribs, before it becomes a public rumor. Soon the rumor will travel by donkey, by ox cart, by ship, carrying not goods but need. The hillside stands, the terraces hold, but the world beneath the roots is changing. Across the sea at Ugarit, the harbour murmurs with ropes and oars, yet the palace letters sound thinner each month. Scribes press wedges into wet clay, requests for barley, tallies of shipments delayed, acknowledgements of debts that cannot be met. Send grain quickly, one tablet begs, or we will die. The words dry beside a brazier, then harden in an oven that sighs with heat like patient breath. The king signs his name in protocol and hope, trusting wind and goodwill to carry the plea. Behind his seal stands a city brimming with craft, with metalworkers and merchants and singers who know the taste of feast days, but none of them can coax rain from the horizon. On the quay, a merchant tilts an empty amphora, as if it might remember wine. In the storehouses, the counters run their hands over baskets, as if touch could multiply grain. Letters travel faster than seasons, yet not fast enough to outrun hunger. The tablets will survive the fire that will one day come, and when we read them now, the clay still feels warm with worry. North in Hatti, the lion-gated roads lead through uplands that demand respect from seeds. The Hittite court understands logistics like a second language. Caravans stair-step across ranges, mules nod under sacks, and scribes map supply lines the way generals map campaigns. But drought cheats mathematics. Without surplus in the valleys, the mountains can only echo the word less. Clay notes tally shortfalls, envoys ride farther to ask for loans in grain, and gifts of copper or silver begin to feel like apologies. Armies will always march in a king's mind, yet soldiers cannot eat treaties. When the central granaries turn hollow, strategy becomes a vocabulary for postponing emptiness. The empire that looked like a fortress proves to be a ledger tied to weather, page after page of obligations leaning on a sky that will not sign. Still, the courtyards fill for morning rituals, and the priests lift bowls as if they could ladle clouds. Dignity keeps its posture even when the shelves grow tired. Egypt holds the Nile like a string to the moon, and the river's flood is a calendar of mercy. Even so, the world beyond the delta knocks at the granary door. Letters arrive from Canaanite princes and coastal governors, polite at first, then pleading, then terse. Wheat, please wheat, our people starve. Pharaoh answers as a son should, sending ships with measured sacks, weighing charity against treasury, reputation against reserve. To feed neighbors is to purchase quiet along the routes, but the bill is tall. Grain once traveled as gift, now it travels as guarantee. The scribes of the House of Life record outflows with careful signs. The counters touch the ceilings twice, and the overseer of the magazines listens for rumor the way sailors listen for wind. Egypt remains standing, but generosity has thresholds, and policy cannot irrigate a continent. Even the mightiest river cannot be everywhere. Today's scholars read the past with instruments that turn mud into memory. Pollen trapped in peatlands layers its testimony. Fewer oaks, more hardy shrubs, shifts that hint at drying. Tree rings tighten, their wooden diaries, speaking of growing seasons that lost their stride. Speleothems drip in cave darkness, ticking oxygen ratios that rise and fall like breath under blankets of stone. None of these things pronounce verdicts alone, yet together they form a choir of caution. The late 2nd millennium BCE bent toward aridity in many regions, not everywhere at once, not always the same, but enough to lean the table and make every cup, slide a little. Drought is rarely a wall, it is a slope. Cities on that slope feel gravity where once they felt momentum. When you listen to the science, it sounds like dust in a long corridor, soft but persistent, following the footsteps of traders and kings. Markets change their faces when bread thins. A merchant in Byblus, who once smiled over purple-dyed cloth, now watches the price of barley with a gambler's breath. Copper ingots are still heavy, tin remains rare, but the new luxury is the weight of filled sacks. Caravans take different paths, hugging riverbeds and springs. Ships depart with cargoes that rustle rather than clink. Contracts shorten, promises shrink to the distance a donkey can reliably walk without water. Some palaces open emergency stores and calm a season. Others hoard and light fear like a lamp in the window. Inflation is a rumor that turns true when repeated, and speculation is a shadow that grows when grain casts it. Through it all, scribes count, merchants shrug, and mothers divide loaves with precision that feels like prayer. The economy learns the grammar of less. Movement becomes the grammar of survival. Families leave terraces that no longer answer to the plow, following rumors of rain along coastlines and river mouths. Pastoralists shift their circuits, arriving early at wells already crowded with strangers whose dialects taste of salt and islands. City gates learn new manners, welcome when storerooms are brimming, wary when jars are hollow. Hosts remember that guests can become neighbors, and neighbors can become rivals when pasture is a ledger rather than a landscape. No single caravan calls itself an exodus, yet the roads feel busier with reasons. In the quiet mathematics of drought, one village's survival borrows from another's margin, and the sums do not balance. Later ages will write songs about invaders. The tablets here only mutter about mouths. Where hunger goes, identity follows, trying on names that fit the next harbor. Rituals answer where policy hesitates. In stormhouses on hilltops, priests of the weather gods lift bronze ladles to a sky that keeps its own counsel. Names change with the map. Bol-Hadad, Teshub, the lady who walks with clouds, but the gesture is older than any kingdom. Communities gather, grain offerings measured from what cannot be spared, drums low like thunder rehearsed. When the rain does not come, the question of blame begins its slow search. Neglected vows, a king's offense, a neighbor's envy, the strangers at the well. Ritual can soothe, can bind, can carry memory from one dry season to the next, yet it cannot fill a jar. Faith remains, but faith is not flour. The people return to their fields with quieter steps, and the gods keep their distance like mountains. By the time the drought's map is wide enough to read from the stars, the palaces have learned new tones in their letters. Requests become negotiations. Negotiations become ultimatums wrapped in courtesy. A governor promises timber if barley arrives. A prince offers soldiers if wheat will be advanced against next year's tax. Somewhere, an honest shipmaster counts sacks twice and writes that the sea itself is thinner with sails, because famine reduces courage. The world has not fallen, but it has leaned. The first cracks are administrative, promises late, rosters light, repairs deferred. The second cracks are human. Tired eyes at the gate, shorter feasts, quicker tempers cooled by longer silences. And in those spaces, other forces will later find room. Tremors underfoot, and sails on horizons that do not carry gifts. The dominoes of drought do not fall all at once, but one by one until the shape of the age is different. A village cannot spare its share, so a palace writes letters in sharper ink. A palace misses its shipment, so an empire thins its stores. An empire cannot supply its allies, so treaties bend under weight they were not built to bear. When we read this sequence on broken tablets, it seems simple, but to those who lived it, each step felt like an ordinary hardship, survivable if only the next season was kinder. But kindness did not return. Instead, hunger stacked itself like stone upon stone, building walls that even kings could not climb. This is the quiet rhythm of collapse. Not a single thunderclap, but a string of hollow harvests echoing into silence. Scribes in Ugarat pressed their words into clay, believing someone on the other shore would answer. Enemy ships are sighted, but send grain, one letter says, revealing two shadows at once. Hunger had already weakened defenses, and now danger floated on the horizon. The tablet, baked in fire, never reached its reader. Instead, it reached us, across millennia. We hold it today in glass cases, the wedge marks still sharp, the urgency still trembling in its lines. There is no poetry in the words, no myth, only the raw fact of need. It is perhaps the most human voice of all, the cry for bread. Granaries tell their own stories. Archaeologists find rooms once stacked high with barley, now charred black, their contents destroyed in fire. In other sites, the storerooms are simply empty, abandoned without explanation, their walls still standing but their purpose gone. These spaces echo with the absence of food. No treasure chamber, no throne room, carries the weight of these hollows, for it was here, in the simplest of rooms, that survival was measured. When the stores failed, the palace failed, and when the palace failed, the network unraveled. Hunger leaves no monuments, but it leaves silence where voices used to be. Egyptian scribes noted shipments sent to Levantian cities, but they also recorded shortages at home. The Nile could still flood, but when demands grew beyond its gift, even abundance seemed thin. Pharaoh's wealth was vast, yet every sack of wheat sent abroad was one less for Egypt's own households. The image of a mighty empire hides the strain of calculation. Who to feed, how much to spare, when to say no. The letters of allies pleading for grain were answered, but not always enough, not always in time. Even the great river could not quench a countenance thirst. And so Egypt emerged from the drought still standing, but wearied, its coffers lighter, its neighbors weaker, and its own strength stretched thin. For ordinary families, the drought reshaped daily life in ways both small and piercing. Meals became fewer. Bread was cut thinner. Children grew restless at night, asking for food that was not there. Farmers turned to substitutes, mixing husks with flour, stretching soups with weeds. Hunger does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives as a gnawing emptiness, as worry in a mother's eyes, as quiet conversations between neighbors about whether to leave or endure. To survive was to adapt, but adaptation carried its own costs. Exhaustion, mistrust, and a sense that the gods had turned their faces away. Priests sought answers in ritual. Temples rang with prayers for rain. Offerings of grain, precious even in scarcity, were placed upon altars. The people gathered, hoping that ceremony could sway the heavens. But the skies remained unmoved. Each unanswered prayer deepened unease. Was it the fault of the king, of the people, of foreigners at the gate? When rain does not come, blame seeks a home. Faith bound communities together, yet it also sharpened divisions when promises went unfulfilled. The drought tested not only the soil, but the spirit. Migration became the quiet answer for many. Families packed what they could carry and walked toward rumors of greener fields. Some took to the sea, joining groups that would later be remembered as strangers or raiders. Others pressed into neighboring lands, sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared. Movement is the oldest response to hunger, but when too many move at once, pressure builds. Hosts worry about their own stores, while newcomers carry desperation like a second shadow. These migrations did not yet topple empires, but they strained every border, every village, every gate. Hunger traveled, and with it, unrest. The drought also reshaped economies. Where once merchants bargained over luxury goods, purple cloth, ivory, or fine oil, now the only commodity that mattered was grain. The value of metal shifted. Gold and silver weighed less than barley and wheat. Ships that once carried treasures now carried survival. And when the sea lanes failed to deliver, trust collapsed. Palaces that relied on imports lost not just goods, but confidence. In a world of scarcity, generosity withered, and suspicion bloomed. The bonds of trade that once made the Bronze Age shine became fragile cords fraying in the wind. By the time the drought reached its height, the late Bronze Age was no longer the same. Kings who once sent gifts of gold now sent pleas for bread. Armies once proud and mighty were reduced in number, not by battle, but by empty stomachs. Farmers who once tilled their ancestral fields left in search of rain. Priests who once promised divine favor searched for answers they could not find. The silence of the skies had rewritten the map of power. The world had not yet collapsed, but the balance had shifted so far that collapse was waiting just beyond the horizon. The Shadow of Drought reminds us that history is not only shaped by swords and thrones, but by the simple act of rain or its absence. The late Bronze Age was an age of glittering palaces and far-reaching trade, yet all of it rested on soil, on seeds, and on clouds. When the clouds refused to come, the age of connection trembled. This is where the unraveling began, not in fire, not in war, but in silence, in skies that stayed clear too long. And from this silence, every other challenge, famine, migration, and conflict, would soon emerge. Hunger moves slowly at first, like a shadow that lingers at the edge of vision. It begins in the villages, where farmers stretch their grain further than it can go. But soon the emptiness presses upward, climbing from household to palace, until even kings taste the uncertainty of famine. The phrase "famine at the gates" is not just a metaphor. In the late Bronze Age, it was reality written into clay, carried by envoys, whispered at court. Storehouses that once overflowed now echoed hollow. The palace guards still stood at the door, but behind them, shelves were bare. Inscriptions and letters tell us of desperation, of kingdoms asking for food instead of riches, of rulers who feared not only invaders, but the relentless hunger within their own walls. At Ugarit, letters preserved in ash reveal the immediacy of the crisis. "Send grain quickly," one ruler wrote, "or we will die." The tone is stark, lacking the ceremony of diplomacy, the polish of politics. These were not requests for luxury, nor negotiations of trade. They were lifelines tossed across the sea. Imagine the scribe pressing urgent signs into wet clay, hoping the words would arrive before it was too late. Yet ships could be delayed, storms could scatter fleets, and sometimes aid never came at all. Famine had no patience, and hunger waited for no reply. The famine was not contained to one kingdom. Hatti, the great Hittite empire, recorded food shortages as well. Their capital, Hattusa, perched high in Anatolia, was not easily supplied in times of scarcity. Caravans had to travel long distances, and when surrounding lands also suffered, there was little left to send. Royal tablets speak of imports of grain, sometimes begged for, sometimes demanded. But when every neighbor is starving, generosity shrinks. Alliances grew brittle, and friendships forged in peace weakened under the pressure of empty bellies. Egypt too felt the strain. The Nile's cycles still nourished fields, but neighboring rulers wrote pleading letters to Pharaoh. "Send us grain." To answer meant giving away Egypt's strength. To refuse risked unrest or rebellion among allies. Pharaoh walked a narrow path, balancing compassion, diplomacy, and survival. In this way, famine became not just a natural crisis, but a political test. The strongest empire could not ignore the hunger of its neighbors. The gates of famine opened wide, and even mighty Egypt stood at their threshold. For ordinary people, famine meant choices no family wished to make. Meals shrank, bread thinned, and substitutes appeared in the diet. Husks mixed with flour, weeds ground into meal. Mothers rationed food for children, fathers searched for trade where none could be found. Hunger eroded dignity slowly, leaving behind only the will to endure. When hunger deepened, migration followed. Families abandoned villages, seeking refuge in cities or neighboring lands. These movements, driven by famine, planted seeds of unrest that would echo for generations. The letters of Ugarit show how famine blurred the line between friend and enemy. One tablet mentions ships on the horizon. Were they merchants bringing relief, or raiders drawn by weakness? The fear of hunger mixed with the fear of attack, creating a perfect storm of anxiety. In this atmosphere, famine was not just an absence of food, but the erosion of trust. Palaces once secure in their alliances began to doubt their partners. Hunger gnawed at bonds as surely as it gnawed at bones. Merchants felt the change most directly. Grain, once a background commodity, became the center of every deal. Prices soared. A sack of barley outweighed silver in importance. Markets that once hummed with variety narrowed to survival. Ships that once carried luxuries now carried wheat. The famine changed the very character of trade, turning commerce into triage. And in such a world, the wealthy might survive longer, but even wealth had limits when the harvests failed. The imagery of famine at the gates is more than poetic. In cities like Ugarit or Byblus, people literally gathered at palace gates, hoping for food. The palace, symbol of stability, became a wall between hunger and provision. Guards stood firm, but they too needed food. The thin line of authority trembled under the weight of need. When hunger pressed against the gates, power itself was tested. What good is a throne if it cannot feed its people? Archaeology confirms this story. Granaries at several sites were found empty, their walls intact but their purpose abandoned. At other places, the remains of charred grain hint at hurried destruction, perhaps cities torched by enemies when supplies ran low. In these ruins, we see famine not as myth but as lived history. The absence of food left marks deeper than fire or stone. It left silence in the places where life once thrived. In the highlands of Canaan, new settlements appeared as people left the plains. Scholars debate their origins, but famine offers one answer. When fields fail, families move. These shifts in population shaped the next era, planting the seeds of new identities and cultures. The Iron Age would emerge from these movements, but its roots were in necessity, in hunger that drove people to new lands. Famine was not only destruction, it was also transformation. Pharaoh's inscriptions speak proudly of sending aid, of keeping order while others faltered. Yet we know Egypt was strained as well. The image of a benevolent provider masked the calculations of survival. How much could be spared without weakening Egypt itself? How many allies could be fed before resources ran dry? Famine forced choices that shaped diplomacy as much as any treaty. Hunger at the gates became hunger at the heart of power. To understand famine is to understand collapse. Armies may win or lose battles, but they cannot fight on empty stomachs. Ships may sail far, but they cannot deliver when there is nothing to load. Kings may wear crowns, but crowns do not feed children. Famine stripped away illusions of strength, revealing the fragility beneath. The late Bronze Age was not ended by famine alone, but famine was the weight that bent its knees. In temples, priests offered grain to gods of storm and sky, pleading for rain. These offerings carried a cruel irony. The people gave what they could least afford. Ritual bound the community together, but it also deepened the pain of scarcity. When the rains did not come, faith was tested. Blame whispered in the streets. Perhaps the king had angered the gods. Perhaps foreigners had brought curses. Hunger breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds unrest. The sea peoples, often remembered as raiders, may also have been migrants pushed by hunger. If their homelands suffered drought and famine, then their ships carried not only weapons, but families, seeking food and safety. To those they approached, they looked like invaders. To themselves, they may have felt like survivors. Famine reshaped identities, turning neighbors into threats, and wanderers into legends. We must remember that famine is not dramatic in its daily appearance. It is slow, creeping into routines. A smaller loaf of bread, a longer wait between meals, a field left fallow not by choice but by necessity. Collapse does not always come with fire and war. Sometimes it comes with silence, with absence, with hunger that grows so familiar it becomes part of life, until life itself falters. The letters of Ugarit / the tablets of Hattusa, the inscriptions of Egypt, together they tell one story. A world once confident in its networks of trade and trust, found itself powerless against the sky. Food is the foundation of every promise. When food disappeared, promises broke. And with those broken promises, the foundations of the Bronze Age began to crumble. Even in famine, there were moments of resilience. Communities helped one another. Families stretched what they had. Some survived by adapting, by moving, by finding new ways to live. Out of hunger came migration, and out of migration came the beginnings of new cultures. The Iron Age, with its different tools, its new settlements, and its altered powers, was born partly from these desperate choices. The famine at the gates was not only about food, it was about order, trust, and the bonds that held kingdoms together. Hunger revealed the fragility of the system. It was the whisper before the storm, the emptiness that prepared the way for collapse. When we think of the end of the Late Bronze Age, we must picture not only raiders and fire, but also fields gone dry, jars gone empty, and people waiting at palace gates for bread that never came. Tonight, as we let this story settle like evening air, we see famine not as a distant tragedy, but as a reminder of how closely human life is tied to the rhythms of nature. Palaces rose high, but they too depended on rain. Empires commanded armies, but they too depended on harvests. In the silence of famine, we hear the first clear note of collapse. And it is in that silence that the story of the Late Bronze Age moves forward. The earth itself became restless during the Late Bronze Age, as if the soil shared in the anxieties of the people. Across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have uncovered layers of collapsed walls, toppled stones, and foundations split by sudden force. Some scholars speak of an earthquake storm, a series of tremors rolling across decades, striking cities from Troy in the northwest to Cyprus and the Levant in the east. Imagine the stillness of a warm night, broken by the ground's low growl, then the violent heave of earth that pulled walls down like paper screens. For those who had already faced hunger and failing trade, the trembling earth was another weight upon their fragile world. In cities like Mycenae, stone walls that had stood for centuries shifted on their bases. Houses cracked, palaces fractured, and the people who had trusted in solid stone suddenly found no safety in their strength. Earthquakes leave behind not only rubble, but memory. The memory of insecurity. Villagers rebuilding after one quake faced the fear of another. To invest in stone again was to test fate. Every aftershock was a reminder that their world could crumble without warning. And each collapse required rebuilding at a cost many communities could not afford. On Cyprus, sites such as Enkomi reveal destruction layers that suggest seismic activity. Buildings that had stood proud with storerooms of copper ingots were thrown down in moments. Traders who came to exchange grain for metal found instead ruins filled with dust. The island that was once the heart of bronze production now had to spend its strength simply surviving. Even the wealth of copper could not shield against the power of earth. And when production faltered, the entire Mediterranean web that depended on bronze felt the tremors echo. The Hittite lands too were shaken. Anatolia sits upon restless fault lines, and in those years the ground spoke often. Cities suffered repeated blows, their defenses weakened not by war, but by trembling. Imagine the empire stretched thin by drought and famine, now facing the costly task of rebuilding its very foundations. Walls toppled, temples cracked, and the people looked to their kings for stability that even stone could not promise. The image of empire, unmovable and proud, now seemed fragile against the whims of geology. Egypt recorded the movements of the heavens and the flooding of the Nile, but little about quakes. Yet even their tremors may have been felt, rattling palaces and temples. For Egyptians, the earth was the stage of gods, and when it trembled, meaning was sought in divine will. Rituals may have multiplied, prayers spoken to gods of order to restrain the chaos beneath their feet. While less visible in their records, the unease of tremors must have added to the tension already felt across the region. To rebuild was costly. After every collapse, people gathered stones, reset timbers, and patched walls. But resources were already strained by drought and famine. Rebuilding once was possible. Rebuilding twice or 3 times tested even the wealthiest of palaces. Each tremor drew on reserves of labor, wood, and faith. And when resources ran dry, ruins were left standing, silent witnesses of resilience stretched too far. Abandoned towns became markers of the earth's unrest, dotting the landscape with reminders of human limits. Archaeologists find in these destruction layers evidence of fire mingled with rubble. Was it earthquake alone, or earthquake followed by opportunistic attack? The two often came together. When walls fell, enemies or desperate neighbors took advantage. The trembling of the earth weakened defenses, and human ambition completed the ruin. Thus, the quake was not only a natural disaster, but a spark that exposed human fragility. Nature and conflict walked hand in hand, each worsening the other. For ordinary people, the fear was constant. Farmers who worried about rain now worried about ground that might swallow their homes. Families who once stored grain in solid jars found them shattered in an instant. Temples where they sought comfort cracked open, statues of gods tumbling as if the heavens themselves had fallen. When the earth betrays, even faith trembles, yet life continued. People built again, lived again, though always with an eye toward the shifting soil beneath their feet. The idea of an earthquake storm comes from modern scholars who see clusters of seismic destruction across the region. Instead of one great quake, the Late Bronze Age may have endured many over several decades, each alone survivable, but together devastating. A single tremor might bring down part of a palace. Another, a few years later, could ruin what had just been rebuilt. The repetition was cruel, draining resilience with every shock. Like waves against a wall, the tremors wore down the strength of the age. These quakes added weight to already weakened systems. Drought had thinned harvests, famine had hollowed granaries, trade had slowed, and now the earth shook what little stability remained. Palaces that once looked eternal began to seem temporary. Walls that symbolized power became symbols of vulnerability. Every tremor reminded people that nothing, no king, no treaty, no stone was beyond breaking. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age was not caused by earthquakes alone, but their rumbling presence magnified every other weakness. When we walk through ruins today, we see walls tumbled in heaps, foundations skewed, and stones cracked in patterns that whisper of seismic force. These are the frozen echoes of moments when the ground moved faster than human hands could respond. Archaeologists sift through them, piecing together the story of collapse not from legend, but from fractures in stone. Every fallen block is a word in the earth's diary, telling of nights when the ground itself betrayed its builders. In this way, the earth became another actor in the drama of the age. Not an invader with ships, nor a neighbor with armies, but a force that struck without warning. Its silence before the tremor was as unsettling as the noise during it. People learned to live with the possibility that stability could vanish in a heartbeat. And when they rebuilt not only walls, but courage. Yet courage too has limits, and eventually some simply walked away. Abandoned cities tell us of resilience spent. Imagine Troy, rebuilt after fires and conflict, then struck by quakes that toppled towers once more. Each rebuilding carried memory, but also exhaustion. How many times can a people believe in permanence when permanence itself crumbles? The ruins of Troy remind us that collapse is rarely one cause. Hunger, conflict, and trembling earth combined to make survival harder with each generation. The stones that lie scattered today are not only ruins of war, but also ruins of restless ground. For those who endured it, the tremors must have felt like omens. Priests read meaning into the shaking, declaring that gods were angry or that rulers had failed. Common folk may have whispered that the end of the world was near. In reality, it was not the end, but it was an ending, the closing of one chapter of history. The ground did not swallow them whole, but it took away their certainty. And in uncertain soil, new ages are sown. In Cyprus, rebuilding after quakes left its cities vulnerable when raiders arrived. Weak walls, stretched resources, and exhausted populations created openings that outsiders could exploit. Thus, natural disaster flowed into human disaster. The earthquake did not destroy the island alone. It prepared the way for others to do so. This is how nature and history weave together. The trembling ground makes room for trembling societies, and in that overlap, collapse finds fertile soil. The memory of quakes lingered long after stones were reset. Even generations later, stories must have been told of nights when the ground buckled, of ancestors buried under rubble. These memories became part of cultural identity, reminders of fragility. Children grew up knowing that the earth itself could not always be trusted. And when later challenges arose, famine, invasion, change, those memories of trembling must have colored how people understood every new hardship. The past haunted the present. Modern seismologists trace fault lines, matching them with patterns in the ruins. The evidence is compelling. Quakes came not once, but many times. Some cities survived, others fell permanently silent. The puzzle of collapse gains another piece, showing how nature and human systems intersect. When we consider the late Bronze Age, we must picture not only hungry people and hostile fleets, but also restless ground shifting beneath their feet. The collapse was not only above the earth, but within it. And so, the trembling earth joined drought and famine in reshaping history. It weakened walls, drained resources, and unsettled minds. It did not topple empires alone, but it made their fall more likely, more complete. The earthquake storm was not a single moment, but a chorus of instability. Its echoes remain in the ruins we explore today, reminders that even the strongest walls are no match for the ground they stand upon. Tonight, as we let these images settle, we hear the low hum of the earth beneath us, usually steady, sometimes restless, always present. The people of the late Bronze Age learned this lesson in the hardest way. Their palaces, their temples, their homes, all depended on ground that could betray them. And so collapse gathered strength not only from hunger and conflict, but from the simple truth that the earth itself trembles. Let this reminder drift with you into the quiet, a story of stone and soil, of fragility written deep into the land. After each tremor, after each fire, after each raid, people were faced with a decision: rebuild or walk away. For centuries, the choice was almost always to rebuild. Palaces rose again from rubble, walls were patched, storerooms were refilled with whatever could be gathered. Yet every act of rebuilding came with a cost, and as the late Bronze Age staggered under drought and hunger, the cost grew unbearable. The stress of rebuilding became its own quiet enemy, wearing down kingdoms more than any battle might. In my scene, Masons once carved stones so large they seemed eternal. But when walls cracked, replacing them required workers, tools, and food to sustain laborers. Each stone set was not just a marker of strength, but of resources drained from elsewhere. Farmers whose fields had already shrunk were asked for more grain to feed builders. Villagers strained as their sons carried stone instead of tending crops. The act of repair solved one problem while creating another. Rebuilding was never free. Ugarit faced this cycle. Fires gutted sections of the city, and residents cleared rubble to build anew. But timber had to be imported, and stone hauled from quarries. Every beam lifted echoed with the absence of something else. Fewer men in the fields, fewer guards on the walls, fewer hands for trade. To keep a city standing meant choosing which other needs to neglect. In time, the choices grew heavier than the stones themselves. Cyprus, rich with copper, also bore scars of rebuilding. Earthquakes rattled its cities, forcing repairs that drained the wealth meant for trade. Ships that once carried copper ingots now carried timber for reconstruction. The profits of bronze became the debts of survival. For merchants, rebuilding meant fewer luxuries to sell, and for kings, it meant fewer gifts to offer in diplomacy. The web of connections strained as each link was pulled tighter. In Hattusa, the Hittite capital, rebuilding tested the empire's patience. Already weakened by famine, the labor demanded by reconstruction frayed loyalty. Nobles pressed peasants into service, and peasants grumbled under the weight of endless tasks. Temples were patched, walls reset, but resentment simmered. When kings asked for loyalty, the people remembered the stones they had carried and the food they had gone without. Repairing walls may have protected the city, but it cracked the bond between ruler and ruled. Egypt, with its great monuments, seemed the land most capable of rebuilding. But even here, repairs drained coffers. Temples needed constant attention. Pyramids and statues cracked under time and tremor. The pharaohs projected eternal power, yet eternity required endless investment. When resources thinned, even Egypt had to choose: maintain grandeur or feed its people. The stress of rebuilding blurred the line between ritual necessity and practical survival. Each rebuilding effort also carried symbolic weight. To rebuild was to defy collapse, to insist that order could be restored. Communities took pride in the act, gathering together to raise walls again. But symbols cannot fill stomachs, and pride cannot pay debts. Over time, the burden outweighed the meaning. What once unified people began to divide them. Some questioned whether rebuilding was worth the sacrifice. Others whispered of leaving instead of laboring again. The act that once restored hope now deepened fatigue. Archaeologists see layers of destruction followed by rebuilding, then destruction again. This pattern repeats at many sites. It is a rhythm of hope and disappointment. A city burns, then rises. An earthquake falls, then walls are patched. But each cycle leaves traces thinner than the last. Houses are rebuilt smaller, storerooms emptier, palaces less grand. Rebuilding became not restoration, but reduction. The stress hollowed both the cities and the spirits of their people. Consider the cost in timber. Forests were felled to rebuild roofs, to craft beams strong enough to hold palaces. Yet timber also fueled ships, smelters, and trade. When trees became scarce, priorities collided. Should wood go to ships, to trade for grain, or to homes, to shelter families? Each choice carried consequences. Rebuilding was not only physical labor, but constant negotiation of scarcity. The stress was also psychological. To rebuild is to believe the future will hold. But repeated collapse shakes belief itself. People grew weary of trusting that the next wall would stand, that the next harvest would come. Anxiety spread like cracks in plaster. Communities rebuilt because they must, but hope drained from the effort. Weariness became the unseen mortar binding stone upon stone. For kings, rebuilding was a statement of legitimacy. A palace restored meant authority restored. But as repairs became frequent, the statement weakened. Subjects saw not strength, but fragility. A king whose palace burned or fell too often seemed cursed or incompetent. Thus the stress of rebuilding eroded royal power as much as walls. The very act meant to display control instead revealed vulnerability. Diplomacy too suffered. Once, kings sent gifts of bronze and ivory. Now they sent apologies for delays, excuses for why repairs consumed their resources. Alliances strained when one partner could no longer provide tribute or aid. Trust wore thin as rebuilding drained treasuries. The international system, once vibrant with exchange, dulled under the burden of constant recovery. Merchants bore scars of rebuilding as well. Cities consumed what little wealth remained on repairs, leaving little to spend on trade. Ports emptied, markets shrank, and caravans grew fewer. For traders who thrived on movement, rebuilding meant stagnation. Prosperity stalled while walls were raised. Hunger deepened while palaces restored their grandeur. The people noticed. Resentment brewed. Religious life shifted under the weight of rebuilding. Temples demanded repair, for they were houses of gods. Yet offerings grew meager as people starved. Priests argued for resources, kings struggled to provide, and ordinary worshippers wondered whether divine favor had truly abandoned them. To patch a temple was to patch faith itself. But patched faith is fragile. Each quake that cracked a wall cracked belief a little deeper. Families faced the hardest choices. To help rebuild the palace was to neglect their fields. To neglect their fields was to invite hunger. Either path carried risk. Some chose loyalty, others chose survival. Communities split, not by war, but by fatigue. The stress of rebuilding fractured society long before enemies struck. When raiders or migrants arrived, many cities were already half empty, their people exhausted. Walls patched too often could not hold. Morale patched too thin could not endure. Rebuilding had drained the very resilience needed to resist. Collapse came not with a single blow, but after years of attrition by effort itself. The archaeology of abandonment tells this tale. Cities left unrepaired, walls toppled but not razed, palaces silent. It was not always destruction that ended them, but decision. People chose to leave rather than rebuild again. In these choices lies the truest mark of stress. Collapse is sometimes simply the refusal to begin again. Looking back, we see how rebuilding was both noble and destructive. It displayed resilience, but drained strength. It inspired hope, but sowed fatigue. The stress of rebuilding was not measured only in stone, but in spirits worn thin. It was another thread pulled from the web of the late Bronze Age, leaving the tapestry weaker with each repair. Tonight, as you rest, consider how fragile endurance can be. To rebuild is human, to hope is human, but hope must be nourished. In the late Bronze Age, hope starved alongside bodies. The stones rose, then fell, then rose again, until at last no one remained to raise them. And in the quiet ruins, the stress of rebuilding lingers still. A lesson whispered by broken walls. The sea is often imagined as a path of connection, linking ports and people. But in the closing centuries of the Bronze Age, it also became a path of fear. From the harbors of the Levant to the shores of Cyprus and Egypt, watchers scanned the horizon for sails that might not be friendly. Inscriptions from Egypt speak of strangers arriving in great numbers, some with families in tow, others armed for battle. These groups, remembered as the Sea Peoples, became the embodiment of anxiety. Raiders on the horizon, neither fully enemy armies nor fully wandering migrants, but something in between. Their presence added another weight to kingdoms already strained by hunger, drought, and trembling earth. The letters of Ugrit make the tension clear. One tablet records a frantic warning of enemy ships approaching, a plea for aid that never came in time. To live in Ugrit was to feel both the hunger of famine and the dread of invasion. Raiders struck quickly, moving from coast to coast, burning towns and taking supplies. Yet these were not always faceless marauders. Some carried families, children, and elders, suggesting migrations wrapped inside raids. To locals, the distinction mattered little. Ships on the horizon were fear itself, a reminder that vulnerability was no longer only from the sky or soil, but from the sea. Egyptian records describe battles against these intruders. At Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, reliefs carve the drama in stone. Ships with high prows, warriors with feathered headdresses, archers firing from decks, and Egyptians fighting to repel them. The inscriptions boast of victory, claiming the pharaoh saved Egypt from chaos. Yet even in triumph, the text reveals the scale of the threat. Whole confederations moved together, not just warriors, but families. They were not a single tribe or nation, but a wave of people displaced and desperate. Their raids both attack and survival. For coastal villagers, the arrival of raiders was devastating. A single night could undo generations of labor. Houses torched, granaries emptied, livestock taken, survivors scattered. In regions already weakened by famine, recovery was nearly impossible. The fear of ships became part of daily life. Watchers were posted along coasts, scanning the sea for shapes against the horizon. Tablets from Pylos speak of such coast watchers. Their role proved that the threat was constant. A community did not need to be attacked to be afraid. The possibility was enough. Raiders exploited the fragility created by drought and quakes. They struck where defenses were thin, where palaces had drained their wealth on rebuilding, where granaries already echoed hollow. They came as opportunists, yet their opportunity was created by natural disaster. In this way, the Sea Peoples were both symptom and cause. Symptom of a world unraveling, cause of further ruin. For those who faced them, it mattered little which label fit. What mattered was survival. Trade routes shifted under the pressure. Merchants who once carried copper or textiles now feared interception. Ships traveled less often or hugged coastlines more tightly. Markets shrank and trust thinned. To trade required safety, and safety was gone. Every missing ship, every burned port, weakened the network of exchange further. The Sea Peoples may not have destroyed the system alone, but they hastened its collapse by making seas unsafe. The identities of these groups remain debated. Egyptian texts name them Peleset, Jekka, Denyon, Sherdan, Shekelesh, each with different origins, perhaps in the Aegean, Anatolia, or islands further west. Scholars argue about where they came from, whether they were mercenaries turned restless, refugees of famine, or displaced communities seeking land. The truth may be all of these. They were not one people, but many, united by need. To the kingdoms they encountered, their names mattered less than their actions. To see their sails was to feel dread. The raids carried a rhythm of unpredictability. Some years passed quietly, others saw flares of violence. This unpredictability deepened anxiety. How can a farmer plan a harvest or a merchant a voyage when the threat of attack hangs over every decision? Insecurity seeps into daily life, eroding confidence as surely as hunger. It was not only food or stone that collapsed in this age, but trust. The sea peoples also left traces of settlement. In the coastal lands of Canaan, newcomers appeared with pottery styles and tools reminiscent of the Aegean. The Philistines, remembered in later texts, may have been part of this wave. Archaeological finds at Ashkelon and other sites reveal cultural blends. Local traditions mixed with foreign ones. Raiders became settlers, invaders became neighbors. For those displaced, it was a tragedy. For history, it was transformation. The stress of facing raids also changed politics. Kings once confident in their walls now struggled to protect even their nearest towns. Letters grew sharper, alliances thinner. Some rulers hired mercenaries, others fortified harbors, but nothing provided lasting security. When raiders can appear at any coast, power itself feels temporary. Thrones no longer rested on stability, but on chance. And chance is no foundation for empire. Imagine standing on a beach at twilight, a farmer or fisherman watching the horizon. The sea is calm, the sky painted with fading light. Yet every silhouette of a sail sends a shiver. Is it a merchant bringing oil, or an enemy bringing fire? The horizon, once a promise of trade, becomes a question mark. Fear itself becomes a constant companion, reshaping how people lived, how they trusted, how they dreamed. Egypt claimed victory against these groups, and perhaps it was true for a time. Reliefs show prisoners, ships captured, enemies slain. Yet the persistence of references to the sea peoples shows they were not a fleeting threat. Even in defeat, they remained. Their presence marked the turning of the age, when seas no longer belonged to trade alone, but to struggle. Egypt survived, but weaker, drained by the effort of constant defense. For the sea peoples themselves, their story was likely different. Perhaps they saw themselves not as raiders, but as migrants seeking survival. Hunger had driven them, loss had pushed them, the sea had carried them. To them, the raids were lifelines, the only way to secure food and land for their families. History remembers them as destroyers, yet they too were victims of collapse. The line between invader and refugee blurs when survival is at stake. Archaeology adds nuance. Pottery fragments, tools, and DNA from coastal burials suggest cultural mixing, not only conquest. The sea peoples did not simply vanish. They became part of the mosaic of the Iron Age. Their children grew up speaking local tongues, farming local fields, shaping new communities. What began as terror on the horizon ended as transformation on the ground. The raids also reveal the weakness of complex systems. A single ship burning a port could ripple across trade networks. One town lost meant goods delayed, contracts broken, alliances strained. Small sparks set great fires in systems already stretched thin. The sea peoples were sparks, not the fire alone, but enough to ignite collapse. When we read about them today, we often focus on battles and destruction. But behind every raid was the quiet human story. Families fleeing hunger, sailors navigating by stars, villagers mourning lost homes. The raids were history's violence, but also history's migration. To remember them only as enemies is to forget their humanity. As the late Bronze Age faded, the horizon never regained its old certainty. The sea was no longer simply a highway of exchange, but a reminder of fragility. Raiders on the horizon became part of memory, shaping stories for generations. And in those memories, the age of palaces and networks gave way to an age of survival and adaptation. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the sound of waves against the shore. For the people of the late Bronze Age, that sound was not only comfort, but also warning. The horizon was both promise and threat, beauty and fear. In those waves, in those sails, we hear the echo of raiders who changed the course of history. And in their echo, the story of collapse grows clearer, like a tide moving quietly toward the land. The fall of great powers is rarely sudden. It is usually a slow unraveling, a steady loss of strength until only the shell remains. In the late Bronze Age, kingdoms that once seemed eternal, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the cities of the Levant, found themselves hollowed by hunger, shaken by quakes, and harried by raiders. What we remember as collapse was not a single day, but years of decline, each thread pulled until the tapestry fell apart. Tonight we trace those threads, watching palaces grow silent, walls abandoned, and letters cease mid-sentence. The Hittite Empire was among the first to crumble. From its capital at Hattusa, the kings once commanded vast lands across Anatolia and Syria. Their armies were disciplined, their diplomacy respected. Yet drought thinned their fields, and invasions pressed their borders. When the granaries emptied, soldiers deserted, merchants fled, and allies turned away. Hattusa itself was abandoned, its gates left open to wind and time. The empire that once rivaled Egypt vanished, leaving behind ruins scattered among Anatolian hills. The silence of Hattusa was the silence of power lost. Mycenae too faced decline. Palaces that had dominated the Greek mainland burned. Whether by raiders, internal strife, or accident compounded by hunger, their destruction marked the end of an age. The Linear B tablets, once filled with careful accounting, ceased forever. Trade routes that had connected the Aegean to Cyprus and beyond withered. Warriors who once sailed to Troy now fought simply to survive. The fall of Mycenae did not erase the Greeks, but it ended the world of palatial kings, paving the way for centuries of obscurity. Ugarit's end is recorded in fragments. Letters were left half-written, as if scribes fled before finishing their words. The city was burned, its people scattered. This once bustling hub of trade and diplomacy disappeared almost overnight. Archaeologists find storerooms sealed by ash, granaries still holding grain, suggesting the end came suddenly. Perhaps it was raiders, perhaps fire following quake, perhaps famine made recovery impossible. Whatever the cause, Ugarit's silence marked the collapse of the Levant's brightest jewel. Egypt, long a symbol of stability, also faltered, though it endured longer than others. Ramesses III repelled invasions, carving victories in stone at Medinet Habu. Yet even Egypt was not immune to strain. The treasury grew thin. Workers in Deir el-Medina once went on strike, the first recorded in history because they had not been fed. Egypt survived, but it emerged weaker, its golden age fading. Power that had stretched across empires narrowed to survival at home. The fall of these powers reshaped the map. Where once empires commanded, now small kingdoms and villages filled the void. The interconnected world dissolved into fragments. Diplomacy written in Akkadian ceased. Trade dwindled. The international age of the late Bronze Age ended. What replaced it was humbler, more localized, less grand. But it was also more resilient in its simplicity. Great powers had fallen, yet life continued in smaller, quieter forms. Archaeology shows the scars. Palaces burned, their walls charred black, storerooms emptied, archives buried in ash. Some sites were rebuilt briefly, then abandoned. Others were left untouched, their ruins slowly swallowed by earth. Each ruin tells the same story. Wealth and power cannot stand without food, without trust, without security. Collapse is not the end of life, but the end of complexity. The fall of the Hittites left Anatolia open for newcomers. Phrygians, Luwians, and later Assyrians would rise in the vacuum. The fall of Mycenae ushered in what some call the Greek Dark Age, a time of smaller communities and lost literacy. The fall of Ugarit erased a hub of trade that would never return in the same form. Each fall cleared the stage for what came next, even if the actors were smaller, their voices quieter. History always moves forward, even through ruin, for the people living through it. The fall was not history, but daily life. A farmer found the palace no longer collected his grain. A merchant found the harbor too dangerous to sail. A soldier found his pay stopped. Collapse was not dramatic for most, it was absence. The absence of orders, of protection, of certainty. Life became local, survival immediate. Empires vanished in archives, but in villages, people simply adapted. The fall of great powers is often remembered in terms of loss. Yet we must also see continuity. Farmers still sowed seeds, potters still shaped clay, children still played in courtyards. The structures of power disappeared, but the pulse of human life continued. Collapse is an ending, but also a transformation. The late Bronze Age ended, and the Iron Age began. The powers that fell cleared space for new societies to rise. Egypt's survival, though diminished, offers a contrast. While others fell, Egypt endured. But endurance came at a price. Reduced influence abroad, internal unrest, and economic strain. Ramesses III's reign was a last flare of power. After him, decline deepened. Egypt was not destroyed, but its place as a great power shifted. It became another survivor, rather than the center of the world it once had been. Why did some fall while others endured? Part of the answer lies in geography. Egypt had the Nile, a reliable lifeline even in drought. Hatti and Mycenae lacked such stability. Part lies in leadership, part in luck. But the broader truth is that no system can endure endless strain. The combination of famine, quakes, raids, and migration tested every society. Most failed. Egypt endured only by narrowing its ambitions. The fall of great powers also marked the fall of great records. The rich archives of Hattusa and Ugarit ceased. The Linear B tablets stopped. Writing nearly vanished from Greece for centuries. When powers fall, memory often falls with them. What we know comes from fragments, broken tablets, scattered ruins, echoes in later texts. The voices of kings fell silent, leaving us to reconstruct their stories from what remains. Legends later filled the silence. Greeks told of a great war at Troy, a conflict that may echo the struggles of this time. In the Bible, memories of Philistines and migrations recall the movement of peoples. Egyptian inscriptions turned victories into timeless boasts. Where history faltered, story filled the gaps. Collapse became myth as much as memory, and through myth, the fall of powers lived on. We should not see collapse only as destruction. It was also creation. The fall of palaces freed villages to grow into new societies. The end of vast empires opened space for innovation. Simpler systems replaced fragile complexity. Iron tools, new scripts, and fresh cultures emerged. Collapse was both an end and a beginning. To call it only fall is to miss the rebirth within. For archaeologists, the fall of powers is both tragedy and opportunity. The ruins they uncover reveal lives once hidden. Burn layers preserve archives. Abandoned houses preserve tools. What was lost became what we find. The fall gifted us windows into a past that might otherwise have been erased. In loss, knowledge was saved. The fall of the late Bronze Age powers reminds us of fragility. Great walls, great armies, great treasuries, none endured the weight of combined disasters, yet humanity endured. Collapse did not end people, it ended systems. New systems rose, shaped by memory of what had fallen. That is the rhythm of history. As you rest tonight, imagine the silent halls of Hattusa, the burned palaces of Mycenae, the ash-covered archives of Ugarit, once vibrant, now quiet. Their silence speaks of fragility, but also resilience. Out of ruins, life began again. And as we listen to their story, we hear not only of endings, but of the beginnings, quietly waiting beyond them. The late Bronze Age was a system of connections. Palaces in Mycenae, Ugarit, Hattusa, and Thebes were tied by letters, by treaties, and by ships that carried copper, tin, oil, and grain. For centuries, this web created wealth and stability. But when drought, famine, and raids shook the foundations, the system began to unravel. What had once been strength became weakness. Dependency turned into vulnerability. When one strand broke, others followed, until the web itself collapsed into silence. Imagine a merchant in Ugarit, waiting at the harbor for a ship from Cyprus. In normal times, the cargo would be predictable: copper, ingots, timber, jars of oil. But as famine spread and raiders prowled the sea, the ship did not come. Without copper, bronze workshops lay idle. Without oil, contracts could not be met. The failure of a single voyage rippled outward. The merchant's debt pressed on him, his workers went unpaid, and the palace received no tribute. In a connected world, absence traveled as fast as presence. Palaces once thrived on the flow of goods. Grain from one land, timber from another, metals from distant mountains. When any part failed, the palace economy stalled. Administrators recorded shortages, but tablets alone could not restore supplies. Each failed shipment tightened the strain. The system had no cushion, no room for error. Complexity had been strength, but it had also been fragility. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and in these years many links snapped. Letters preserved in clay show rulers pleading with one another. A king writes, "Send food, or we die." Another demands timber for repairs. Another asks for aid against raiders. Each letter reflects not power, but dependence. The rulers of the late Bronze Age were less masters of their fate than caretakers of a fragile balance. When their neighbors faltered, they too stumbled. The unraveling was not one empire falling, but many tied together, falling together. Egypt's archives show similar strain. Pharaohs still received tribute, but it was smaller, less frequent, often delayed. Their wealth no longer reflected abundance, but the desperation of allies. Ships arrived with requests as often as with goods. The great image of Egypt as provider masked its own exhaustion. The system expected Egypt to supply stability, yet Egypt itself grew weaker in the attempt. The unraveling was shared. No land could carry the weight of all. Consider the scribes. they once recorded luxury goods. Gold, ivory, fine textiles. Now they're tablets filled with lists of grain, tallies of rations, debts unpaid. The language of wealth turned into the language of survival. When archives are filled with pleas rather than boasts, it signals not confidence, but crisis. These clay records are the fingerprints of unraveling, pressed by weary hands into fragile tablets. The unraveling also reached diplomacy. The brother kings who once called each other equals grew suspicious. Was aid delayed because of weakness or because of betrayal? Treaties faltered, envoys went unanswered, and mistrust spread. A system built on cooperation dissolved into guarded silence. Without trust, even the strongest web disintegrates. Alliances broke not in war, but in hunger and doubt. Trade routes grew empty. Ships that once sailed confidently across the Aegean and Levant stayed in harbor. Caravans dwindled. Merchants who once carried news and culture across lands vanished. Without their movement, connections faded. Ideas slowed. Cultures that had been vibrant mosaics became isolated fragments. The unraveling was not just economic, but cultural. The international age became a local age. Archaeology shows this shift clearly. Pottery styles, once widely shared, became regional. Scripts, once used across kingdoms, disappeared. Languages narrowed. The interconnected world shrank into pockets of survival. What was lost was not only wealth, but identity. The sense of belonging to a greater Mediterranean system dissolved. People no longer thought in terms of empires, but of villages. The unraveling of the system was the unraveling of imagination itself. When raiders appeared, their impact was magnified by the weakened system. A single burned port now disrupted trade across regions. A stolen cargo meant workshops silenced, armies unfed. The raiders were not unstoppable, but the system they struck had no resilience left. Complexity that once absorbed shocks now magnified them. The unraveling was not about single defeats, but about the loss of capacity to recover. The collapse of Hattusa, the abandonment of Mycenaean palaces, the burning of Ugarit / all can be seen as part of this unraveling. Each depended on the others. When Hatti fell, its trade routes collapsed. When Ugarit burned, Egypt lost a partner. When Mycenae weakened, Cyprus lost a market. The web that once gave strength now dragged them down together. Interconnection became contagion. For ordinary people, the unraveling meant uncertainty. Farmers could no longer rely on palaces to store and distribute grain. Merchants lost protection for their roots. Artisans lost buyers for their crafts. Communities turned inward. Local solutions replaced international ones. Resilience came not from the system, but from the village. Yet villages too carried scars of famine and fear. Survival became narrower, harsher, lonelier. Even religion felt the unraveling. Gods once worshipped across regions narrowed to local cults. Temples lost the resources for grand rituals. Priests adapted with smaller offerings, humbler prayers. Faith survived, but it too became local, stripped of the grandeur of empire. The great system of shared belief fractured into fragments of practice, each surviving in its own way. The unraveling was not sudden. For years, palaces tried to hold the web together. They rebuilt, wrote letters, sent ships, called on allies. But each year it grew harder. Each effort felt thinner. At some point, the system crossed an invisible line. It no longer held together. No matter how hard rulers tried, the unraveling became collapse. From collapse came change. Out of the ruins of great powers emerged smaller, more self-sufficient communities. These would become the seeds of new cultures. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Israelites, all rose from the vacuum left by the collapse. The unraveling ended one world, but prepared the ground for another. History is never only ending. It is always renewal. When we speak of the Bronze Age collapse, we often focus on raiders or famine, but the deeper story is the system itself. It was too complex, too fragile, too dependent. The unraveling was inevitable once strain piled high. No single cause was enough, but together they pulled the web apart. The story is not just about destruction, but about the limits of complexity. Today we see the unraveling in ruins, in abandoned cities and broken tablets, but we also see resilience in the people who adapted. The system collapsed, but humanity endured. Villages continued, cultures evolved, and new ideas were born. The unraveling of one age became the weaving of another. From threads torn came new patterns. That is the rhythm of history. As you rest tonight, imagine the web of connections stretching across the ancient world. Picture each strand grain, metal, treaties, trust. One by one they snap, until the web falls into silence. That silence is not emptiness, but the pause before renewal. Systems unravel, but people continue. And from their endurance comes the next chapter of history, written softly in the ashes of the old. When great systems collapse, they rarely leave emptiness behind. Instead, new communities rise in the spaces once held by palaces and empires. After the unraveling of the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean did not fall silent. It shifted. Smaller societies, once overshadowed by vast kingdoms, now began to grow. The dawn of new peoples emerged from ruins as survivors adapted to a harsher, simpler world. This was not the end of history, but the quiet beginning of another chapter. On the coast of Canaan, newcomers settled among the ruins of cities. Archaeology at Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron shows pottery with Aegean designs, mixed with local traditions. These settlers, remembered as the Philistines, may have been part of the Sea Peoples. Their arrival was both feared and transformative. They brought new styles of cooking, new ways of building, and perhaps new gods. To the locals, they were intruders. To history, they became a permanent part of the land, shaping centuries to come. In the highlands of Canaan, small villages began to spread. Without great palaces to demand tribute, people organized more simply. Houses clustered together, fields tended for local survival rather than distant lords. Some scholars see in these highland villages the beginnings of Israel, small communities bound by kinship, shaped by resilience. From famine and collapse, a new society slowly formed, humble in its start, enduring in its legacy. Phoenician cities along the Levantine coast also rose in this dawn. Tyre, Sidon, and Byblus survived where Ugarit fell. They turned their attention to the sea, perfecting trade and navigation. In time, they would sail beyond the Mediterranean, carrying their alphabet and culture with them. Their resilience came from adaptation. Instead of relying on fragile land routes, they trusted the sea, turning danger into opportunity. Out of collapse, the Phoenicians launched an age of exploration. In Greece, the fall of Mycenaean palaces gave way to centuries often called a dark age. Yet, even in darkness, seeds grew. Small communities developed oral traditions, stories told by firelight of heroes and wars. These tales, shaped by memory of collapse, would one day become the epics of Homer. The Greeks lost their writing for a time, but they did not lose their voice. Out of silence, a new culture gathered strength, preparing for a future that would shape the Western world. In Anatolia, new groups filled the void left by the Hittites. The Phrygians rose in the central plateau, bringing with them new traditions and rulers. Luwian principalities survived in the south, their hieroglyphic inscriptions whispering the continuation of older cultures. The land once unified under Hattusa, now fractured into many smaller states. This fragmentation was weakness compared to empire, yet it also allowed flexibility. In diversity, Anatolia endured. Cyprus, shaken by quakes and raids, also recovered. Its copper mines still gleamed with promise, and though cities shifted, the island remained a hub of trade. Migrants from the Aegean may have settled here, blending with locals. The pottery and houses reveal mixtures of style, signs of adaptation and change. Cyprus shows that even in disaster, resources attract resilience. Its role as supplier of bronze carried it into the new age. The newcomers did not simply replace the old. They blended, merged, and reshaped. In Canaan, Philistine pottery borrowed local forms. In Phoenician ports, Aegean styles merged with Levantine craft. In Anatolia, Luwian and Phrygian traditions intertwined. Collapse scattered people, but it also brought them together in unexpected ways. Out of mixing, new identities were born. This dawn was not uniform, but patchwork. And in patchwork lay survival. The dawn of new peoples also changed religion. Old gods faded with abandoned temples, but faith did not vanish. The Philistines carried gods from across the sea. Highland villages formed local traditions. Phoenician cities honored Baal and Astarte, blending storm and sea deities into their rituals. In Anatolia, old Hittite gods lived on in smaller cults. Faith adapted to new realities, surviving even as kingdoms fell. The divine followed the people, taking new names, new shapes. Writing too changed. The great scripts of Pallas's Linear B, cuneiform archives vanished. But in Phoenicia, a simpler alphabet began to spread. Easy to learn, flexible to use, it would outlast the palatial systems. From the collapse of complexity, simplicity triumphed. The Phoenician alphabet would one day travel across seas, shaping the scripts of Greece, Rome, and beyond. Out of loss came a tool that carried memory further than any palace tablet. Economy shrank, but did not vanish. Local markets replaced international ones. Villagers bartered grain, oil, and wool. Craft survived in humble forms. What had been luxury became necessity. The scale of life narrowed, yet within this narrowness, communities became self-reliant. They no longer looked outward to distant kings, but inward to their own fields and families. This local focus was the foundation of the Iron Age to come. For those who lived through it, the dawn was not obvious. They did not think of themselves as new peoples. They thought only of survival. To plant, to harvest, to build again after fire. Yet in their quiet choices lay the shape of the future. They carried pottery styles, stories, and tools that would define cultures yet unnamed. The dawn was not dramatic, but patient, and in patience, history grows. Migration defined this dawn. Families moved across lands, carrying traditions with them. Some became Philistines, others Phoenicians, others Israelites. Their movements were responses to famine, to quake, to invasion, but in moving, they reshaped the world. Collapse scattered them, but scattering planted seeds. These seeds would grow into new cultures, new nations, and new histories. In Egypt, the memory of raids lived on. but Egypt itself narrowed its focus. Weaker abroad, it still provided stability at home. Egypt became less the great power of old, more a survivor among survivors. Its role in this dawn was quieter, but still present. Egyptian records give us glimpses of newcomers on their borders, reminders that even as Egypt endured, the world around it had transformed. The dawn was not peaceful everywhere. Conflict flared between locals and newcomers, between villagers and migrants. Yet out of conflict came adaptation. Over time, neighbors became communities, and hostilities softened into exchange. Shared survival built bonds stronger than old enmities. The new peoples were not welcomed easily, but they could not be erased. Time wove them into the fabric of the land. Legends later remembered this dawn in fragments. Biblical tales of Philistines, Greek stories of wandering heroes, Phoenician myths of sea voyages. These memories carry the shadow of collapse, but also the light of beginnings. Myth remembers what history forgets: the fear of strangers, the hope of new homes, the blending of cultures in uncertain times. Archaeology confirms the quiet rise. Ashkelon reveals Philistine feasts. Highland sites reveal early villages with simple houses. Phoenician ports reveal continuity of trade. Each shard, each wall, each burial tells us of life reshaping itself. The dawn of new peoples is not a single story, but many small ones, stitched together across lands and seas. The Iron Age that followed carried their legacy. New tools, new scripts, new political systems all grew from these seeds. Out of collapse came creativity. Out of hunger came innovation. The great palaces were gone, but the human spirit endured. The dawn of new peoples was not a golden age, but it was fertile ground. From it grew civilizations that would one day shine brighter than those that fell. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the quiet after collapse. Smoke fading from ruins, but new fires kindling in small hearths. People planting, building, telling stories, shaping futures they could not yet see. This is the dawn of new peoples, fragile, humble, but full of possibility. Out of endings, beginnings, out of silence, voices rising once more. And in their rising, history continued its long, patient song. The Bronze Age collapse was written not only in drought and hunger, but in flame. Across the Mediterranean, cities that had stood for centuries were consumed by fire. Archaeologists uncover layers of ash/charred beams and melted pottery, signs of sudden destruction. Was it raiders, earthquakes, followed by opportunists, or revolts from within? Perhaps all played a part. What matters is that fire left a signature across the map. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Ugarit, Hazor, each shows the blackened scars of cities lost to flame. To those who lived there, fire was terror in the night. To us, it is evidence of endings. Ugarit offers one of the clearest stories. In storerooms sealed by fire, archaeologists found tablets still waiting to be delivered. Letters of plea. Enemy ships are here. Send aid quickly. Never left the city. Flames overtook palace and temple alike, silencing the scribes mid-sentence. When the fire died, Ugarit never rose again. Its harbor, once crowded with ships, fell silent. Its archives, once alive with words, turned to clay fossils. The fire did not just consume buildings, it consumed continuity. In Mycenae, palaces, perched on their rocky hills, burned. The Lion Gate still stands today, but behind it once lay halls now blackened by ancient flame. Whether sparked by invaders or unrest within, the destruction was final. Linear B tablets cease, palatial authority vanishes, and the Greek mainland entered centuries of quiet. Fires here were not simply accidents. They marked the end of palatial power. The great houses of kings fell not only to hunger, but to burning nights. At Hazor in the Levant, the ruins tell the same tale. Temples cracked by quake were finished by fire. Storerooms collapsed in ash. Statues were toppled, sometimes deliberately, their faces shattered. Fire here was both destruction and statement. Whoever lit it wanted more than resources. They wanted erasure. Hazor's silence lingered for centuries, its memory absorbed into later stories of conquest and change. Archaeology uncovers its layers, but the flames speak louder than any tablet. The fires were often swift. A city might be thriving one week, its markets filled, its walls strong. The next, it was embers. Fire spreads faster than defense. Wood beams, dry from summer, roofs thatched with straw, storerooms filled with grain, all fuel for catastrophe. For those inside, there was little escape. Families fled, carrying what they could, but many perished. The charred skeletons found in ruins are silent witnesses to that terror. To archaeologists, burned layers are blessings. They freeze time. Pots left on hearths, tools dropped in panic, archives sealed in ash. Fire destroyed, but it preserved moments. We see not only loss, but daily life interrupted. Through ruin, memory is saved. The irony is sharp. Fire that ended lives now lets us remember them. The spread of fire was contagious. One burned city drove refugees into another. Refugees strained resources, causing unrest. Unrest sometimes sparked revolt. Revolt sometimes led to fire. The cycle repeated. Collapse spread not like a wave of battle, but like sparks on dry grass, leaping from place to place. Fire was both cause and symptom, both destroyer and messenger of the age's fragility. Egyptian records of Medinet Habu speak of enemies burning our towns. Reliefs show cities in flame. Defenders fighting desperately, smoke curling upward. For the Egyptians, fire was proof of chaos at their borders. For those cities, it was the final chapter. In stone and inscription, the image of fire was immortalized, turning real suffering into royal narrative. Even here, flame was both history and symbol. The fires also reshaped faith. Temples once thought eternal crumbled. Gods once thought invincible seemed absent. When statues shattered, when sanctuaries burned, people asked if the gods had turned away. Rituals moved into homes, smaller shrines, humbler offerings. Fire closed one era of grand religion, opening another of personal devotion. Even in ruin, belief survived, reshaped, but not erased. For survivors, fire meant exile. A burned city could not sustain them. Families fled to hills, valleys, or across the sea. They carried memories of smoke and loss, stories that would echo as legends. The migrations of these survivors seeded new peoples, new cultures. The destruction that ended one city gave birth to another. Fire cleared ground not only for ruin, but for renewal. The sea peoples were often blamed for these fires, and perhaps they were guilty at times. But not all flames came from foreign hands. Some may have come from rebellion, as subjects tired of feeding palaces during famine. Others may have sparked by chance, in cities weakened by drought and quake. Fire has many origins, but one result: fragility exposed. In every cause, the effect was the same. Ash, where life once thrived. Rebuilding after fire was harder than after quake. Quakes toppled walls, but fire consumed resources. Grain burned, timber reduced to ash, tools melted. Survivors lacked even the basics to begin again. Some tried, building smaller houses amid ruins. Others left, unwilling or unable to reclaim what flame had taken. The stress of rebuilding after fire was often too much. Abandonment was easier than endurance. Archaeology shows this clearly. In sites like Ugarit, the final layer is flame. Above it, no new city rises. The silence is complete. In others, like some Mycenaean centers, rebuilding occurred, but never with the same grandeur. The fire marked a boundary between ages. Once crossed, there was no return. Fire was final. The memory of burning cities lingered in stories. Later, Greeks told of Troy's fiery fall. The Bible spoke of cities consumed. Egyptians carved flames into their records. The motif of fire became part of cultural memory. To them, fire symbolized collapse. To us, it symbolizes transition. The fires of the late Bronze Age were more than disasters. They were markers of change. We often think of collapse as noise, battles, cries, thunder. But fire leaves silence. After it roars, there is only ash, only emptiness. The silence of burned cities is the truest sound of collapse. Palaces once filled with voices became quiet as tombs. And in that quiet, history shifted. For those who study the past, fire is a paradox. It destroys, but it preserves. It erases, but it also records. The ashes of the late Bronze Age are archives in their own way, keeping memories we would otherwise lose. Fire is cruel, but fire is honest. It shows us the fragility of human order and the endurance of memory. The cities that burned remind us that collapse is not always gradual. Sometimes it comes in a single night. A spark, a raid, a rebellion, and centuries of power vanish in hours. That is the terror of fire. That is also its lesson. Nothing built by human hands is immune. But nothing built by human memory is ever truly lost. Tonight, as we reflect on fire in the cities, imagine the glow of embers fading in the night. The smoke clears, the ruins cool, silence settles. Yet out of that silence, people begin again. Fire ended their age, but did not end them. And in their endurance, we find comfort. For fire is never the final word. Renewal always follows. The collapse of the late Bronze Age is often told through the image of abandoned palaces, once filled with scribes, merchants, priests, and kings. These great halls fell silent. The sound of footsteps on polished stone, the voices of envoys speaking in Akkadian, the rustle of papyrus and clay tablets vanished. What remained were ruins open to sky and birdsong. The silence of palaces is one of the most haunting legacies of the age. To step through them today is to walk in the echo of absence, a reminder of how fragile power can be. At Mycenae, the Lion Gate still towers, its stone lions staring outward in eternal vigilance. But beyond it, the palace complex is hushed. Corridors where scribes once pressed linear B tablets now lie bare. Storerooms, once filled with oil and wine, stand empty. The hearth of the Megaron is cold, no flames licking upward to light the ceiling. Silence settled here after fire consumed the halls. The rulers who once commanded armies across the Aegean no longer spoke. The palace that was once the heart of Mycenaean power became only a skeleton of stone. In Pylos, Another great palace shared the same fate. Archaeologists uncovered hundreds of Linear B tablets, many half-baked by the flames that destroyed the archive. These tablets record final moments of administration, allocations of grain, preparations for defense, lists of tribute. But then the writing stops. The silence of Pylos is not just architectural, it is literary. No more records, no more decrees. The palace ceased, not only in stone but in word. Silence became its final archive. Ugarit tells a similar story. Once alive with scribes, writing in multiple languages, the city was a hub of diplomacy and trade. But when fire consumed its palaces, the archives were sealed in ash. Letters remained undelivered, their words frozen mid-plea. The palace of Ugarit did not fall gradually. It ended in an instant of destruction. Its silence is deafening because it was sudden. A city so connected to the world vanished in a single generation. Its ruins today hum softly with the weight of what was lost. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, was once a sprawling city with temples, walls, and royal quarters. Its archives were vast, filled with treaties and laws. But when famine, invasions, and tremors drained the empire, Hattusa was abandoned. Palaces emptied, temples fell quiet. What had been an empire stretching across Anatolia dissolved into fragments. The silence of Hattusa is heavy, spread across miles of ruins, lion gates and carved walls standing as mute witnesses. The city became a hollow stage where the actors had left forever. In Egypt, silence was slower. Palaces remained occupied, but their voices grew quieter. Correspondence with foreign powers dwindled. Envoys came less often. The great halls that once echoed with the bustle of international diplomacy narrowed into spaces of domestic rule. Silence here was not sudden but gradual, the dimming of a lamp rather than its snuffing out. Yet even in Egypt, the palatial world was shrinking. The silence spread even where walls still stood. Palaces are not only stone, they are memory. Their silence represents the absence of systems. No more redistribution of grain. No more scribes tallying tribute. No more guards protecting granaries. Without the palace, villagers were left to fend for themselves. Silence was not emptiness, it was decentralization. It was the breaking apart of a world once coordinated by rulers and archives. The silence of palaces was the beginning of the age of villages. The silence also marked the end of certain languages. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaean palaces, vanished when the archives ceased. Hittite cuneiform ended with Hattusa. Ugaritic script disappeared with its city. Silence of palaces was also silence of literacy. For centuries, writing itself retreated, replaced by oral tradition. Epics and stories lived in voices, not on clay. Silence carried into language itself, reshaping how memory was preserved. For those who lived nearby, the silence must have been unsettling. To see a palace that once commanded armies, now standing empty, its gates open, its halls cold, this was not simply ruin, but transformation. The authority of kings dissolved. Ordinary people had to adapt. They no longer sent tribute. They kept what little they had. Silence was liberation for some, but loss for many. Without palaces, the structure of their world was gone. Archaeology shows silence in the layers above destruction. We find smaller houses built among ruins, humble homes where great halls once stood. Families repurposed palace stones for their walls. Life continued, but at a smaller scale. The silence was filled not with nothing, but with new voices. Children playing in courtyards where kings once feasted, farmers storing grain where envoys once dined, Palaces died, but people lived. Silence was not emptiness, it was change. Legends later remembered these silences. For the Greeks, memories of Mycenae and Pylos became the backdrop for Homer's epics. For Israel, the memory of Philistines and Canaanite cities lived in scripture. For Egypt, the records of raids and burned towns filled inscriptions. The silence of palaces was remembered in story, reshaped into myth. Memory spoke where stone no longer did. Silence turned into song. The silence of palaces also shows us the fragility of complexity. Systems built on trade, writing, and administration collapse completely when their core is destroyed. Villages can endure famine by adapting, but palaces cannot. Once their archives fall quiet, they do not return. Silence is final for complex systems. It is a reminder that what feels eternal is often temporary. The silence is not just historical, it is a warning. When you stand in Mycenae today, the silence is profound. The wind through broken walls, the distant call of birds, the faint sound of tourists' footsteps. These are the only voices. The halls of Agamemnon no longer echo with orders. The silence is not oppressive, but contemplative. It invites us to reflect on time, on fragility, on the impermanence of human grandeur. Silence is the true monument of collapse. The same is true in Hattusa. Walk its long streets, and you hear nothing but the breeze. The temples are empty, their altars bare. The carved lions watch silently, guardians of absence. Once a city of thousands, now it whispers only to archaeologists. Its silence is vast, filling valleys with memory. The empire is gone, but its silence endures. Silence can be louder than sound. The absence of scribes, the absence of merchants, the absence of kings all speak more clearly than their presence. The silence of palaces tells us of collapse more profoundly than any inscription. It is the voice of what is no longer there. And yet, in its way, silence is eloquent. It reminds us of limits, of change, of continuity beyond grandeur. For villages, the silence opened possibilities. Without palaces to demand tribute, farmers kept their harvests. Without armies to conscript them, young men stayed in fields. Simpler lives endured where complex ones failed. Silence became survival, and survival became the foundation of the Iron Age. Palaces fell, but people adapted. Their silence was filled by the hum of ordinary life, a softer, steadier sound. The silence of palaces is also a lesson in humility. Great walls, monumental gates, vast storerooms, all can fall quiet. Power does not last forever, but silence is not defeat. It is transition. Out of it grew new cultures, new languages, new societies. The silence of the late Bronze Age was the seedbed of the future. Gentle reflection on silence soothes us. It reminds us that even when great voices stop, the human story continues. Silence is not the end of life, only the end of one form of it. The Bronze Age collapsed, but humanity endured. Its palaces fell silent, but its villages carried on. Silence was a pause, not a conclusion. Tonight, as you rest, imagine walking through a ruined palace. The walls rise broken, the sky open above. The halls are empty, but your footsteps echo softly. You feel the weight of silence, but also its peace. In this silence, history speaks more gently than words. It tells you that nothing lasts forever, but also that life always continues. The silence of palaces is not only a story of endings, it is also a story of renewal. The quiet after collapse became the soil in which new societies grew. Silence allowed memory to reshape into myth, allowed communities to start fresh. The ruins stand, not to mourn forever, but to remind us of resilience. Out of silence, life always returns. Knowledge can vanish not with an explosion, but with a whisper. The Bronze Age collapse was not only the fall of palaces and cities, it was the fading of memory. Scripts fell silent, archives stopped, and whole traditions of knowledge were lost. What had been carefully recorded on clay tablets, papyrus, and parchment disappeared into silence. For centuries, people lived without the written systems that once defined their world. This was the age of forgotten knowledge. In Mycenaean Greece, linear B-script was the lifeblood of palace administration. Scribes recorded taxes, tallied grain, noted sacrifices, and managed armies. But when palaces burned, the tablets perished. Without scribes, the script vanished. Generations passed without anyone remembering how to read or write it. Greece entered centuries of illiteracy. Oral tradition replaced written records. Stories lived in memory, carried by voice, never fixed in clay. Forgotten knowledge lingered like an echo, faint but present in song. The Hittites kept vast archives in Hattusa. Thousands of clay tablets recorded treaties, laws, myths, and prayers. But when Hattusa was abandoned, the script ceased. Cuneiform itself survived in Mesopotamia, but Hittite cuneiform was forgotten. For the survivors of Anatolia, literacy became rare, reserved for remnants of priestly or local traditions. An empire that once wrote the first known peace treaty with Egypt left behind ruins that could no longer read their own words. Knowledge once so proud became dust. Ugarit was a marvel of literacy. Its scribes, writing in multiple languages, Akkadian, Hurrian, Egyptian, Hittite, Ugaritic. It was a hub of international communication. But when Ugarit burned, its archives froze in time. Letters unsent, contracts unsigned, stories half-written. The Ugaritic alphabet, an early experiment in writing, was lost. Only centuries later would simpler alphabets spread again through Phoenicia. In that gap, a unique voice was silenced. Knowledge that once tied worlds together vanished in flame. Egypt endured, but even their knowledge shrank. Scribes still copied texts, but fewer envoys arrived from abroad. The international scribal culture, once shared in Akkadian, ceased. Egyptian scribes now wrote mostly for themselves, in their own language. Knowledge that had connected Egypt to Hatti, Ugarit, and Mycenae no longer crossed borders. The silence was not total, but it was isolation. The world of shared learning dissolved. Forgotten knowledge was not only about writing, it was also about craft. The techniques of palace architects, shipwrights, and bronze melters faded. Without steady trade in tin, bronze became scarce. Communities turned to iron, a harder metal but more difficult to forge. The lost knowledge of bronze smelting was replaced by the painful birth of new metallurgy. A skill once perfected was forgotten, forcing people to begin again. Religion too lost parts of its knowledge. Grand rituals, recorded in detail on tablets, disappeared when priests fled or perished. The gods remained, but the exact practices changed. Some rituals survived in fragments, others were abandoned. The silence of palaces meant silence in the temples as well. Oral traditions filled the gap, but details dissolved. Forgotten knowledge lingered in half-remembered prayers. The collapse of literacy reshaped society. Without written records, trade became riskier. Contracts could not be fixed in writing. Trust became more personal, less systemic. Memory, not archives, carried debts and promises. Villages shrank their horizons, because long-distance exchange demanded writing. The age of forgotten knowledge was also the age of local survival. Archaeologists uncover fragments of this loss. Burned tablets, broken inscriptions, unfinished records. These are not only evidence of destruction, but of silence beginning. A letter half-written at Ugarit is the voice of knowledge interrupted. A shattered tablet at Hattusa is a book with no ending. The ruins are libraries burned not only by fire, but by time. Forgotten knowledge is written in absence. For centuries after, Greece had no writing. This period is called its Dark Age, not because life vanished, but because memory did not record itself in text. Yet, even in forgetting, seeds of renewal were planted. Oral tradition kept stories alive. Bards sang of heroes, wars, and gods. These stories would one day become the Iliad and Odyssey. Forgotten knowledge gave way to remembered myth. In loss, new memory was born. Phoenicia preserved part of the answer. Its merchants, needing simple ways to record trade, developed an alphabet of fewer signs. Easier to learn, easier to spread, it replaced complex systems like cuneiform and hieroglyphs. What was forgotten gave birth to what was simpler and more enduring. The alphabet was born out of collapse, and it would shape the future of writing for millennia. Forgotten knowledge cleared the way for lasting knowledge. The silence of literacy teaches us how fragile memory is. Knowledge depends not only on minds, but on systems. When scribes disappear, when archives burn, knowledge dies. It is not enough for one person to remember. Societies need structures to preserve memory. Without them, even the greatest traditions vanish. The Late Bronze Age collapse shows how quickly centuries of knowledge can dissolve in a single generation. Forgotten knowledge is also humbling. For centuries, the world lived without knowing its own past. Mycenaean kings were forgotten. Hittite treaties vanished from memory. Ugarit's letters were unread. Only much later did archaeologists rediscover them, piecing together what was lost. For those who lived after the collapse, history itself was silent. Their world was cut off from its own roots, yet forgotten knowledge was not total. Some skills survived in fragments. Farmers still tilled soil. Weavers still spun cloth. Potters still shaped clay. But the higher knowledge, the knowledge of empires, was gone. Survival knowledge replaced systemic knowledge. Simplicity replaced complexity. It was enough to live, but not enough to preserve the memory of what had been. The dawn of the Iron Age grew out of this forgetting. Iron replaced bronze. Oral tradition replaced palace archives. Simpler alphabets replaced complex scripts. What was lost made space for what was new. The forgetting was painful, but it was also fertile. From silence came renewal. For us, forgotten knowledge is both tragedy and treasure. Tragedy because voices were lost. Treasure because fragments survived. We read half-burned tablets, and in them glimpse the moment before silence fell. Forgotten knowledge is a reminder that memory is fragile, but also that fragments endure. Even in forgetting, something remains. The myths of later centuries preserved echoes. Stories of great wars, migrations, and gods may reflect dim memories of the collapse. Myths are not history, but they are memory transformed. Forgotten knowledge reappears as legend. In this way, memory never vanishes completely. It changes form, from archives to epics, from treaties to tales. Forgotten knowledge also carries a lesson for us. Our own world holds vast memory in fragile forms. What would happen if systems failed? if archives vanished. The Late Bronze Age collapse shows how quickly literacy can be lost. It reminds us to treasure memory, to preserve knowledge with care. For silence can return unless we listen. Archaeologists and historians are guardians of this forgotten knowledge. They sift ruins, read shards, study fragments. Each discovery is a spark against silence. Each inscription translated is a voice restored. Their work reconnects us to what was lost. Forgotten knowledge does not remain forgotten forever. It waits for rediscovery. For those who lived then, however, the silence was real. They lived without the words of their ancestors. They farmed, built, prayed, and dreamed, but without archives to anchor them. Forgotten knowledge meant living only in the present, with little sense of the past. Their resilience lay not in memory, but in adaptation. Gentle reflection shows us the duality, loss and renewal. Forgotten knowledge ended an age, but cleared the way for simpler, more enduring systems. The alphabet, oral tradition, new communities all grew from silence. What was lost in grandeur was gained in durability. Forgotten knowledge was the shadow that made new light possible. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the silence of archives. The scratching of stylus on clay is gone. The halls where scribes once worked are empty. Only wind moves through the ruins. Forgotten knowledge lingers there, not as despair, but as reminder that even in silence, seeds of renewal wait. From forgotten memory, new memory grows. The collapse of the Bronze Age ended one era of technology, but it opened the path to another. Bronze, the metal of kings and palaces, required tin and copper, often traded across vast distances. When trade routes faltered, bronze became scarce. Communities turned instead to iron, a metal more common in the earth, though harder to master. From scarcity came invention. The rise of iron was born not in luxury, but in necessity. Iron had been known for centuries, but it was rare and precious, used more for ornaments than tools. Its smelting demanded higher heat, more precise control of fire than bronze. Palaces had little reason to invest in it, while trade flowed easily. But when bronze disappeared, survival demanded new skills. Smiths learned through trial and error, slowly turning iron from curiosity into utility. The collapse became the forge of innovation. The highlands of Anatolia seem to have been an early cradle of ironworking. Here, after the fall of the Hittites, smaller states experimented with new smelting techniques. The Phrygians and others turned local ore into weapons and tools. Iron did not appear suddenly, but gradually spread, carried by migrants and merchants. As techniques improved, iron became stronger, cheaper, and more reliable than bronze. What began in hardship became the foundation of the Iron Age. For farmers, iron tools were revolutionary. Stronger plowshares cut deeper into soil. Iron sickles harvested more efficiently. Communities that once struggled to till dry land found new strength in these tools. Agriculture stabilized, allowing villagers to grow. Iron was not simply a weapon of war, but a tool of survival. Its spread ensured that even after collapse, fields could feed people again. The rise of iron nourished resilience. War too was reshaped. Iron weapons, once rare, became common. Swords and spears of iron outlasted bronze in battle. Armor grew sturdier, shields stronger. Warriors, who once relied on fragile supply chains of tin, now marched with weapons forged from local earth. The balance of power shifted. Armies no longer depended on distant trade. They depended on their own soil, their own smiths. The rise of iron gave power to those who could forge it well. The Phoenicians played a role in spreading this knowledge. As traders and sailors, they carried iron tools and weapons across the Mediterranean. Their ships became vehicles not only of goods, but of technology. Iron followed their routes, spreading from Levantine ports to islands and coastal lands. With iron, Phoenician cities grew resilient, able to defend themselves and prosper. Trade networks reshaped themselves around this new strength. In Greece, the so-called Dark Age was brightened by iron. Mycenaean palaces were gone, but smaller communities learned to forge iron. Their warriors carried new blades. Their farmers cut the earth with tougher tools. Out of collapse, Greece slowly rebuilt. By the time Homer's epics were sung, iron was the common metal of heroes. Forgotten bronze became the memory of kings, while iron became the metal of ordinary people. The Israelites too emerged in this age. Biblical accounts describe battles where iron chariots seemed invincible. Archaeology shows iron spreading across Canaan, sometimes unevenly, but always growing. Iron marked both advantage and fear. Those who had it dominated, those without struggled. Yet, in time, all gained access. Iron became the shared inheritance of the new peoples rising from collapse. Cyprus, once the island of copper, adapted slowly. Its bronze trade had sustained empires. With bronze in decline, Cyprus turned inward, experimenting with iron while maintaining what copper it still had. In time, it too embraced the new age. The island that once gave the world bronze became part of the story of iron. Its resilience lay in adaptation, not clinging to the past. The rise of iron was not only technological, it was social. Bronze had tied societies to palaces and elites. Control of tin and copper meant control of power. Iron was different. Found in many lands, it loosened the grip of elites. Villagers could forge their own tools. Power decentralized. Authority shifted from great palaces to smaller, local rulers. Iron gave resilience not only to tools, but to societies. This democratization of metal reshaped identity. Warriors were no longer only palace soldiers. Farmers could arm themselves. Communities defended their own land. The rise of iron empowered the many rather than the few. Collapse had destroyed the age of kings, but iron gave rise to the age of peoples. The tools of survival were now within reach of ordinary hands. Religious imagery to absorb the change. Gods were imagined with iron weapons. Smiths took on new spiritual significance, and fire itself became sacred. The forge was not only a workshop, but a temple. To shape iron was to command the earth's strength. Priests and kings may have lost their grip, but blacksmiths gained honor. The rise of iron was also the rise of fire as a divine symbol. Archaeology shows this transformation clearly. Graves of the early Iron Age contained weapons once rare. Everyday tools of iron appear in houses. Pottery and ornaments reflect new styles of strength. The presence of iron marks the shift from fragility to endurance. Where bronze had failed, iron endured. This was not a golden age, but it was a durable one, and in durability lay hope. The shift was uneven. Some regions clung to bronze longer, others embraced iron quickly. But by the first millennium BCE, iron had spread across the Mediterranean. Its rise marked the true end of the Bronze Age. The silence of palaces was filled with the ring of hammers on anvils. Out of collapse came rhythm, the steady beat of survival forged in metal. Forgotten knowledge of bronze was replaced by new knowledge of iron. Where old skills vanished, new ones emerged. The balance of forgetting and learning shaped the new world. Collapse was not only loss, it was exchange. Old crafts fell silent, new crafts sang. The rise of iron was the song of resilience, the melody of renewal. The myths of later times preserved this memory. Stories of smith gods, of heroes with iron weapons, of divine fire shaping the world. These myths remember the awe of iron's arrival. What had once been feared as fragile bronze was replaced by strength. Myths reflect not just battles, but the cultural wonder of iron itself. In story, the rise of iron became divine. Economically, iron reshaped trade. No longer did merchants chase scarce tin across continents. Local ores sufficed. Trade did not vanish, but it shifted. Instead of dependence, there was independence. Iron made survival local. It gave communities the ability to endure without fragile systems. The age of vast networks was gone, replaced by resilience of smaller webs. Politically, the rise of iron supported the growth of new states. Small kingdoms in Israel, Phoenicia, Greece, and Anatolia rose, armed with iron. These states had no palaces like the Bronze Age, but they had durability. Iron weapons defended them, iron tools fed them, iron economies supported them. Out of collapse came new political forms. The rise of iron was the rise of the Iron Age world. Culturally, iron spread stories of resilience. Communities told of how they endured hunger, survived raids, rebuilt with iron tools. These stories became part of identity. To work iron was to belong to the new world. The rise of iron was not only a technological change, but a cultural rebirth. The silence of palaces, the fires of cities, the tremors of earth all led here. To iron, the rise of iron was the answer to collapse. It gave people new tools, new strength, new futures. From fragility to resilience, from dependence to independence. The Iron Age was the child of the Bronze Age collapse. Tonight, as you rest, imagine the glow of forges in the dark, the ring of hammer on metal, the spark of fire in the night. From these forges, the new world was born. Collapse had cleared the ground, iron built anew, and in its strength, humanity found its next chapter. Memory does not always survive in records, especially when archives burn and scripts are forgotten. But memory can take another path, into story, into song, into myth. The Bronze Age collapse left gaps that writing could not fill, and into those gaps, imagination poured. Greeks remembered the age not as lists of tribute or tallies of grain, but as epic tales of heroes and wars. The Iliad and Odyssey, though written later, carry echoes of a world where palaces once stood. They speak of Mycenaean kings, of Troy, of journeys across seas, both dangerous and divine. These epics are not history in a strict sense, but they are history in another sense. Memory reshaped into poetry. Myths preserved what records lost. They gave collapse a voice, and they gave survivors meaning. Through story, the silence of palaces became the song of gods and warriors, a way to explain the inexplicable. In the Levant, the memory of collapse may have shaped biblical traditions. The Philistines, remembered as foes of Israel, were part of the sea peoples who arrived in the aftermath of the Bronze Age's fall. Their presence in Scripture is both history and memory, carrying traces of migration, conflict, and settlement. The stories of Exodus, conquest, and wandering in wilderness may also echo faintly with the displacement of peoples in those years. Myth here was not escape from reality, but an effort to frame reality within a divine plan. To lose cities, to suffer famine, to endure raids, these needed explanation. Memory wrapped in myth gave comfort, turning chaos into narrative. Even when archives were gone, meaning survived. In myth, collapse became not only tragedy, but part of a larger story of faith and destiny. Egypt, too, framed its struggles in mythic terms. Inscriptions of Ramesses III boast of victories against the Sea Peoples, carved into stone at Medinet Habu, to Egyptians. These were not just battles, but cosmic struggles, order defending itself against chaos. Their gods stood beside them, their pharaoh the embodiment of stability. The reality was likely more fragile, Egypt strained and weakened. But in memory and in myth, Egypt was triumphant. The collapse was not admitted, only reframed. In this way, myth became a shield, protecting identity even as systems faltered. Memory in Egypt was selective, turning defeats into victories, decline into endurance. Myth did not simply recall the past, it rewrote it to preserve pride. And so Egypt survived not only in power, but in story. The city of Troy, whether myth or memory, also plays its part. The Greeks told of its burning, of heroes like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus. Archaeology shows that Troy did suffer layers of destruction around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. Perhaps the stories are echoes of real events, reshaped into epic proportions. Myth magnifies memory, but does not invent it entirely. Through Troy, the Greeks remembered a world of palaces and warriors, long after those palaces were gone. The story gave them identity, continuity, and pride. What history lost in detail, myth preserved in essence. Oral tradition became the library of the forgotten age. Bards carried stories across generations, singing them by firelight, repeating them until they became part of culture itself. Oral memory is flexible, changing with each telling, yet it also endures. When writing returned centuries later, these oral traditions were recorded as epic. Without them, the collapse might have left only silence. Instead, it left poetry. Memory survived by moving from clay to voice, from archive to song. Myth also gave collapse meaning. To lose cities and empires is senseless without explanation. Why did the gods allow it? Why did kingdoms fall? Myths answered by framing disaster as destiny, as punishment, as transformation. Collapse became a stage for divine will. People accepted ruin as part of a greater plan. Memory turned pain into purpose. Myth gave dignity to loss. In Anatolia, echoes of Hittite culture survived in Luan inscriptions and legends. Though the empire fell, its gods and heroes remained in stories. The memory of Hattusa's power lingered, reshaped in local cults and myths. These fragments preserved continuity, even when the central archives were gone. Myth was not only Greek or Hebrew, but Anatolian too. Collapse scattered stories, but scattering made them grow in many soils. The Phoenicians too remembered collapse in mythic voyages. Their gods of storm and sea reflected the dangers of migration, the uncertainty of horizons. Their myths of bullfighting the sea serpent may reflect ancient memories of chaos overwhelming order. Through trade and travel, Phoenician myths spread, influencing neighbors. Memory in myth became export, shaping cultures far beyond their shores. Memory in myth is not always accurate, but it is always meaningful. The details blur, but the essence remains. Heroes embody bravery in times of danger. Gods embody forces of nature that once devastated harvests or cities. Myths turn collapse into teaching, loss into legend. They preserve not what happened, but what it meant. And in meaning, memory survives. For centuries, the collapse itself was forgotten in precise terms. No one remembered the names of Ugaritic kings or the laws of Hittite emperors. But everyone remembered stories of wandering peoples, burning cities, heroic struggles, and divine justice. In this way, myth outlasted history. What clay could not preserve, imagination did, and so collapse became part of cultural DNA. Even in forgetting, the memory endured. When archaeologists rediscovered these civilizations, they did so through ruins and records. But when poets and storytellers preserved them, they did so through myth. The two meet in the present. Archaeology confirms fragments of memory, while myth shows how people themselves understood collapse. Together they give us a fuller picture. History tells us what happened, myth tells us what it felt like. The myths of collapse also shaped later identities. The Greeks looked back to heroes of Troy as models. The Israelites remembered the trials of migration as divine tests. Egyptians remembered their kings as saviors of order. Each culture reshaped collapse into a foundation for who they became. Myth was not only memory, but identity. It turned fragility into heritage. Collapse without myth is silence. Collapse with myth is story. This is the great difference. Palaces burned, archives vanished, scripts were forgotten, but myth carried the essence forward. That is why we still know of Troy, of Philistines, of sea raids. Not because the records survived, but because stories did. Myths are the survivors of memory. As iron spread, so too did new myths. Smiths became figures of awe. Gods of fire and forge entered pantheons. Collapse created new technologies, and myth followed. Every innovation birthed a legend. The rise of iron was not just metallurgy, but mythology. Through story, people explained how their world was changing. Even silence became myth. The absence of gods was explained as anger, the absence of kings as punishment. Collapse needed narrative, and myth provided it. Silence itself became meaningful, turned into lessons and warnings. Nothing was wasted. Even void became voice. For those who lived in the aftermath, myth was comfort. It gave hope that their struggles were not random. It promised that their suffering was part of something greater. Memory alone might despair, but myth offered purpose. That purpose carried them through centuries of rebuilding. Archaeology and myth together let us see collapse clearly. The ruins show us what fell. The stories show us what survived. Myths are not reliable maps of history, but they are reliable maps of meaning, and meaning is as important as fact. Collapse is not only studied, it is remembered. The memory of collapse still whispers today. We read Homer, we study the Bible, we marvel at Egyptian reliefs. These are not just literature, but survival. They are memory turned into myth turned into identity. The Bronze Age collapse is not only in ruins, it is in the words we still read and recite. Gentle reflection on memory and myth reminds us of our own stories. How do we explain our crises? How do we give meaning to our losses? We too turn to narrative, to memory reshaped as story. In this, we are not so different from those who survived the Bronze Age collapse. Their myths were their comfort, as ours are ours. Tonight, as you rest, imagine voices by the fire, telling stories of gods and heroes. Outside, ruins smolder, but inside, memory becomes myth. Children listen, elders remember, communities endure. The collapse does not end them, it transforms them. Through story, they survive, and through story, we still hear them, carried across millennia in myth's gentle voice. As we come to the end of this journey through the Bronze Age collapse, let us pause to reflect gently. History often tells its stories in battles and victories, in kings and conquests. But the collapse of this age whispers a different lesson. It was not one single moment, not one enemy, not one disaster. It was a tapestry unraveled thread by thread. Drought, famine, earthquakes, and raids, all woven together until the fabric could hold no more. Tonight we remember not only the fall, but the endurance hidden within. Think of the farmers who sowed seeds in dry fields. Their harvests may have failed, but still they planted. Think of the mothers who stretched loaves thinner, yet still fed their children. Think of the builders who raised walls again after tremors, even when they feared the earth might shake once more. These quiet acts of persistence are as much a part of history as any war. Collapse is dramatic, but survival is quiet and often unseen. Yet, it is in survival that the future takes root. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us of fragility. Great powers with armies, wealth, and monuments fell. Their palaces lie in ruins, their archives in ash. But it also reminds us of resilience. Out of collapse came Phoenicians who sailed further than ever before, Israelites who shaped new traditions, Greeks who carried stories that would become epic poetry. From endings, beginnings, from silence, new voices. History is not only about what is lost, but also what is born. Archaeologists uncover ruins with patience, brushing away soil to reveal broken walls and scattered shards. To some, they are only remnants, but to us, they are memories, each fragment a word in the story of survival. A charred grain in a jar tells of famine. A toppled wall tells of quake. A pot with mixed designs tells of cultures blending in the aftermath. These fragments remind us that even in destruction, something remains to speak. The past never fully vanishes. It lingers, waiting for us to listen. Gentle reflection also invites us to see ourselves. Are we not also part of complex systems, reliant on trade, on weather, on trust between nations? The Bronze Age collapse is not only their story, but a mirror for ours. It whispers caution, that strength is not in vulnerability, and connection can be both blessing and fragility. To remember their world is to reflect on our own. History comforts, but it also teaches. The quiet after collapse was not emptiness, it was possibility. In the spaces where palaces burned, new communities took root. In the silence where kings no longer spoke, new stories were told. From fragments came renewal. From broken systems came fresh beginnings. History flows like a river, sometimes rushing, sometimes slowing, but always moving forward. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of civilization. It was a bend in the river. For those who lived through it, the collapse was not history but memory. They told their children of drought, of hunger, of trembling earth. These stories passed down became legends, myths, sacred texts. What we now study as archaeology, they lived as life. Their resilience is not in monuments, but in the simple fact that we are here to tell their story. Their endurance carried us forward. Their survival is our inheritance. The sea peoples, once feared, became part of new cultures. The Philistines, Phoenicians, and others rose from the tide of collapse. Their pottery, their words, their gods, all wove into the fabric of the Iron Age. They were not merely destroyers, but also creators. Collapse scattered them, but settlement rooted them. Out of movement came new maps, new identities. The horizon that once frightened became the horizon of future civilizations. When we reflect gently, we realize Collapse is not unique. It has happened before, and it will happen again. What matters is not only what falls, but how people endure, how they adapt, how they find new ways to live. The Late Bronze Age teaches us that even when the mighty fall, humanity continues. We find new rhythms, new stories, new homes. The dawn always follows the night. Legends preserve these reflections. Homer's epics carry echoes of Mycenaean heroes. The Bible remembers Philistines and migrations. Egyptian inscriptions immortalize victories against chaos. Memory reshaped into story ensured that the collapse was not forgotten. We may never know all the details, but we know the essence, that fragility and resilience walked hand in hand, and from their steps, new paths were made. Gentle reflections also remind us of perspective. To call it a collapse is our view, centuries later. To them, it was simply life-changing. They did not know an age was ending. They knew only that tomorrow must be faced, with or without palaces. What we name collapse, they lived as transformation. Perhaps in our own time, change may also feel like loss, yet carry seeds of renewal we cannot yet see. The ruins themselves speak softly. Walk through Hattusa, and you feel the emptiness of abandoned gates. Stand at Mycenae, and the Lion Gate towers above silent courtyards. Visit Ugarit, and the ashes of archives still whisper of urgent pleas. These places are not only stones, they are voices, and when we walk among them, we walk among memories. History becomes present, and present becomes reflection. Gentle reflection invites gratitude. Gratitude for those who endured hunger so their children might live. Gratitude for those who carried stories so their culture might survive. Gratitude for those who rebuilt, even when exhausted. Their resilience allowed history to continue. Without them, the world we know would not exist. Reflection turns ruins into reminders of human strength. As the Bronze Age faded into the Iron Age, life grew simpler, but not lesser. Small villages replaced grand palaces. Local trade replaced vast networks. Oral tradition replaced palace archives. Yet from simplicity came durability. These new societies endured where complexity failed. Reflection shows us that sometimes smaller is stronger, quieter, more lasting. In the humblest beginnings, great futures are often born. History for Sleep is not about fear, but about comfort. To know that people endured even collapse is reassurance. Our challenges, too, may feel heavy. But just as they endured famine, quake, and raid, so too do we endure. Their story becomes our lullaby. Fragile, yes, but resilient still. And in that resilience, peace is found. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age is not only tragedy, it is transformation. From endings came beginnings. From ruins came renewal. From silence came song. Reflection softens the edges of disaster, reminding us that change, though difficult, is natural. The past holds sorrow, but also promise. To reflect gently is to rest in that promise. Tonight, as we close this journey, imagine the sea quiet once more. No sails of raiders, no cries of famine, only waves against the shore. The earth is steady, the sky calm. In this stillness, remember the people who lived, who adapted, who carried us forward. Their legacy is not collapse, but continuity. Their story is not fear, but endurance. The dawn of new peoples grew from their trials. We live in the long echo of their resilience. To reflect on their age is to honor them. We honor not their fall, but their survival. Their story is ours, their endurance our inheritance. This reflection carries us gently into rest. So close your eyes and let the story settle. The late Bronze Age has ended, but humanity continues. The ruins whisper of fragility, but also of resilience. And as you drift toward sleep, may their endurance be your comfort, their survival your lullaby. The story of collapse becomes the story of peace, carried softly into the night.